Welcome in the journey of time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history. Perhaps you're lying in bed, or maybe you've simply decided to let the past accompany you for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world. And what time is it for you now? If you find this slow and thoughtful stories of those who came before us brings you a sense of peace and comfort, I'd be honored if you subscribed. So, here's the story. The Weight of Water and Memory. The world was a perpetual, shimmering twilight, a realm where the sun's gold fractured into a million dancing coins upon the surface, far, far above. Below, the light softened to a muted green glow, a cathedral of filtered illumination where dust motes, like tiny ghosts, swirled in slow, eternal currents. This was the domain of the Dnieper River, a place of profound silence, broken only by the low hum of the deep current and the occasional plaintive creak of waterlogged timber from a long-drowned fishing boat. For the being known as Marilla, this was the only world she had ever known, a world of crushing pressure and weightless freedom, a prison and a sanctuary woven from the same water and weed. She drifted, a pale specter in the verdant gloom, her form both solid and ethereal. Her hair, a floating mane of deepest black, fanned around her head like a storm cloud, each strand alive with a subtle phosphorescent light, twining with strands of dark green river grass. Her skin held the pallor of a creature who had never known the full kiss of the sun, a translucent white where the faint tracery of blue veins could be seen, reminiscent of the delicate patterns of frost on a winter pane. Her eyes, wide and unsettlingly clear, were the color of the river itself on an overcast day, a murky, changeable gray-green that seemed to see not just the physical world, but the currents of memory and sorrow flowing through it. She was a Rusalka, a soul bound to the water, a spirit of a maiden who had met a tragic, untimely end. This knowledge was not something she had learned. It was a part of her, a cold stone of truth settled in the hollow where her heart once beat. It was a knowledge that came to her in fragments, in the cold, sharp moments when the moon was full and its silver light pierced the water, stirring a deep, restless agony within her. Tonight was such a night. The water around her began to thrum with a new energy, a lunar pull that resonated with the unquiet dead. A low, melodic humming started in her throat, a wordless, ancient song that was both a lament and a lure. It was a sound that could travel for miles along the river's course, a siren's call woven from loneliness and a desperate, vengeful need. Her home was a drowned grove of ancient willows, their trunks thick with slime and their branches trailing like the withered arms of old men. The reeds here grew tall and dense, their whispers a constant sibilant chorus. "Drown, come drown," they seemed to sigh, their voices the embodiment of the river's darkest intent. Marilla paid them little mind. Their whispers were the background noise of her existence. She moved through the forest of reeds, her long, slender fingers brushing against their stalks. Where her touch fell, a momentary, sickly greenish light would pulse, then fade. A sudden, violent tremor in the water, a discordant splash from the world above, shattered her reverie. Her humming ceased. Her head tilted, a predator catching a scent. The water carried vibrations, the rhythmic, clumsy splashing of oars, the heavy, hollow knock of wood against wood, and most intoxicating of all, the warm, vibrant thrum of a living human heart. She rose, her form cutting through the water with an eel's fluid grace. Upward she swam, towards the fractured moonlight, her gray-green eyes fixed on the dark, bulky shape of a boat silhouetted against the shimmering surface. The world above was a place of danger and desire. The air burned her skin, a dry, scraping agony, but the pull of the life within that vessel was a torment she could not resist. Breaking the surface with barely a ripple, she rested her chin on a floating log, her face partially obscured by a clutch of lily pads. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. Crickets sawed their legs together in a relentless chorus, and frogs croaked their deep-throated songs from the bank. The boat was a simple fishing skiff, old and weathered. In it sat a young man, his back to her. He was humming a folk tune, a simple, cheerful melody that clashed horribly with the mournful dirge still echoing in her own soul. The sound of his voice, so full of unthinking life, sent a spike of pure, undiluted rage through her. This was her purpose. This was the compulsion that the moon and her own cursed nature laid upon her. To lure, to drown, to still the beating hearts that mocked her own stillness. She would pull him down into the cool, silent depths, to add his warmth to the cold collection of the river, to make him a companion in her watery purgatory. A companion who would, like all the others, eventually fade into a silent, mindless wisp, his soul digested by the relentless hunger of the Dnieper. She took a deep breath, a useless gesture for one who did not need air, but one that served to focus her power. Then she began to sing. Her voice was not the crude humming from before. This was a sound of unearthly beauty, a crystalline melody that seemed to weave itself from moonlight and sorrow. It spoke of profound loneliness, of love lost, of a beauty waiting just beneath the water's surface. It was a song that promised comfort, passion, and an end to all earthly pain. The notes wrapped around the young man, penetrating the night air, drowning out the crickets and the frogs. He stopped his own humming, his shoulders tensed. Slowly, almost against his will, he turned. His face was young, open, with kind eyes now wide with a mixture of terror and irresistible fascination. He saw her, not the monster, but the maiden. The moonlight caught the perfect, pearlescent sheen of her skin, the dark, inviting depth of her eyes, the allure of her floating hair. She raised a hand from the water, beckoning him with a slow, graceful curl of her fingers. Her smile was a tragic, beautiful thing. "Come," her voice seemed to whisper on the water, though her lips barely moved. "The water is warm. The world above is full of sorrow. Come to me." He was mesmerized, trapped in the snare of her song. His oar lay forgotten. He leaned over the side of the boat, his hand reaching out towards her spectral form. The boat rocked precariously. Marila's smile widened, a crack in the beautiful facade revealing the predatory void beneath. This was the moment of the catch, the moment the warm, living world delivered another sacrifice to the cold, dead one. But then something shifted. As his fingers neared the water's surface, a memory, sharp and unbidden, lanced through the fog of her vengeful intent. It was not a clear image, but a sensation. The rough, warm texture of a human hand clasping her own. A feeling of safety. A burst of laughter that was not a lament, but a song of pure joy. It was a memory that did not belong to the Rusalka. It belonged to the girl she had been. The name Marilla surfaced in her mind, not as a title she had given herself, but as a name spoken with love. Marilla. The shock of it was like a physical blow. Her song faltered. The enchanting melody cracked, revealing a single raw note of genuine pain beneath. The young man, startled by the shift in the song, blanked. The spell for a heartbeat was broken. He saw not a beautiful water nymph, but a corpse-pale creature with eyes full of ancient misery, her mouth a rictus of anguish. A strangled cry escaped his lips. He scrambled backward in the boat, grabbing his oar and pushing away from her with frantic, terrified strength. Marilla did not pursue him. She sank beneath the surface, the rejected song dying in her throat. She watched the dark shape of his boat recede, the frantic churning of the water from his oars a testament to his terror. The cold stone of her existence felt heavier than ever. The whispers of the reeds returned, louder now, mocking. "Failed! You failed!" But for the first time in her long, drowned existence, their whispers were not the only voice in her head. Another voice, faint and fragile, echoed there. The memory of a name and the ghost of a feeling that was not rage, but love. The journey, it seemed, was not merely one of luring and drowning. It was a journey back into the darkness of her own past to discover who Marilla truly was and why she was condemned to sing her sorrowful song in the moonlit reeds forever. She descended back into the depths, the weight of the water a familiar shroud, but the weight of this new, fragile memory an entirely new and terrifying burden. The adventure of her afterlife had truly begun. The echo in the murk. The descent back into the grove of drowned willows was a retreat into shame. The water, once a medium of effortless grace, now felt thick and resistant, like swimming through cold syrup. The triumphant whispers of the reeds braided against her senses, their taunts 1,000 tiny needles piercing her spectral flesh. He escaped. The warm one fled. You grow weak, sister. The river is disappointed. The river itself seemed to press in on her with a colder, more indifferent weight, its currents tugging at her with a newfound petulance. Marilla coiled herself around the slime-slick trunk of the oldest willow, its bark grooved with the faces of countless other drowned souls, their features blurred by time and river sediment. She pressed her forehead against the rotten wood, seeking its ancient, mindless cold to still the tumult within her. The memory, the sensation of that warm hand and the burst of joyful laughter would not release its hold. It was an echo in the murk of her consciousness, a shard of polished glass in a bed of dull gray stones. This was not how it was supposed to be. The cycle was simple, clean. The lunar pull, the song, the lure, the drowning. A grim harvest to feed the emptiness. There was no room for echoes, for names, for the ghost of laughter. Such things were for the world above, the world of sun and breath and beating hearts. They were artifacts of a life that had been violently erased, and their return felt like a violation of her very nature. She closed her eyes, trying to summon the rage that had fueled her for decades untold. She focused on the young fisherman's face, the initial terror, the desperate flight. She should be furious. She should be plotting her next hunt, her song more potent, her lure more irresistible. But the anger would not kindle. In its place was a profound, bewildering curiosity, a question. Who was Marilla? The name resonated with a specific frequency, a vibration that felt older than the river's curse. It was a peasant's name, common, earthy. It did not belong to a spectral seductress of the deep. It belonged to a girl with sun-warmed skin and calloused hands, a girl who smelled of baking bread and meadow grass, not of damp rot and cold silt. A flicker of movement to her left drew her from her thoughts. Another Rusalka, Zoria, drifted from behind a curtain of thick kelp. Her hair was the color of bleached bone, and her eyes were solid, depthless black orbs, like the pebbles found in a raven's gizzard. Where Marilla's form retained a lingering softness, a whisper of the mortal shape, Zoria was all sharp angles and predatory grace, a pike to Marilla's trout. "The moon is still high, sister." Zoria's voice was a dry rustle, the sound of reeds scraping together in a winter wind. "Yet you return alone. And your song, it broke. I felt it. The river felt it. It was a ugly sound." Marilla did not turn. The catch was unworthy. His fear was too strong. It soured the song. Zoria circled her, a slow, deliberate orbit. "Unworthy? Or were you weak?" She elongated the last word, making it a venomous thing. "I have watched you, Marilla. You drift. You stare at the surface light for hours. You listen to the chatter of the living on the banks. These are not the habits of a true daughter of the deep. These are the habits of one who still longs for the air." "I long for nothing but the silence of the deep," Marilla retorted, the lie feeling brittle even to her own ears. Zoria laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "Do not lie to me. We are sisters in sorrow, bound by the same bitter fate. We drowned in betrayal, in despair. Our power comes from that truth. To forget our pain is to fade. To forgive it is to cease to exist." She drifted closer, her bone-white face inches from Marilla's. "That fisherman, he was young, strong. He reminded you of someone, didn't he? The one who gave you to the water." A jolt, cold and sharp, went through Marilla. Zoria's words were a key turning in a lock she did not know she possessed. The one who gave you to the water. The memory of the warm hand suddenly had a counterpart, a different hand, larger, crushing her wrist. A face contorted not with love, but with a terrible, final purpose. The sensation of being pushed, of cold water shocking the breath from her lungs, of a weight, a millstone, around her ankles. She recoiled from Zoria, from the ugly truth in her black eyes. "No!" "Yes," Zoria hissed, her satisfaction a palpable force in the water. "Embrace it. That is the source of your song. That is the wellspring of your power. Your beauty is the bait, but your rage is the hook. Never forget that. The moment you do, the river will spit you out, and you will be nothing but forgotten mist." With a final contemptuous flick of her pale hair, Zoria dissolved back into the kelp forest, leaving Marilla alone with the burgeoning storm inside her. The memory was no longer a gentle echo. It was a storm surge. Fragments assailed her, disconnected and terrifying. The rough texture of homespun wool against her cheek, the smell of wood smoke and brewing kvass, the taste of wild strawberries, sweet and fleeting on her tongue. And then the crushing darkness, the water filling her mouth, her nose, her lungs, the terrible burning, the final silent scream that had become her first breath in this new, drowned life. She could not stay here. The whispers of the reeds, the judgment of Zoria, the oppressive weight of the sunken grove, it was all suffocating her. The fragile memory needed air, needed space to grow, or it would be crushed by the immense pressure of her curse. Driven by an instinct she did not understand, Marilla began to swim. Not towards the surface and the world of men, but downstream, following the main current of the Dnieper. It was a journey no Rusalka in her memory had ever undertaken. Their territories were small, defined by the place of their drowning, a prison of their own making. To leave was unthinkable. Yet she thought it, and she acted. She moved through landscapes that changed with the river's mood. She passed over fields of smooth gray stones where giant catfish slumbered. She navigated through treacherous rapids where the water roared and frothed, its violence a welcome distraction from the turmoil in her soul. She drifted through silent, abyssal plains where the light from above failed completely, and the only illumination came from the ghostly, pulsating fungi that grew on the bones of a sunken merchant galley. For days she traveled, a pale ghost in the endless flow. The compulsion to sing, to lure, still tugged at her during the moonlit hours, but she suppressed it, focusing on the rhythm of her journey. The memory of the warm hand became her compass. Then she felt it, a change in the water, a subtle shift in the taste of the current. It carried the scent of old wood, of deep, still pools, and of a particular type of weeping willow whose roots drank deeply from the river. It was a familiar scent, a scent from the storm of memories, a scent from before. She slowed her flight, her senses stretching out, tasting the water, reading the stories it carried. And there, nestled in a wide, lazy bend of the river, she saw it, a village, not the one she had just left, with its sturdy, newer docks. This place was older. The houses on the bank were more weathered, the little wooden church on the hill more crooked with age, and on the bank, half submerged and rotting, was the skeleton of an old watermill, its great wheel broken and still. The sight of that mill struck her with the force of a physical blow. The memory was no longer a fragment, it was a flood. She was running, her bare feet slipping on the dewy grass. Laughter trailed behind her, a young man's laughter, warm and teasing. "You can't catch me, Pyotr," she shouted over her shoulder. He was gaining, his longer legs eating up the distance. They reached the old mill, their secret place. He caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, spinning her until she was dizzy. His face, bright with affection and the exertion of the chase, leaned in. Pyotr. His name was Pyotr. And he was the one who had given her to the water. Marilla hung in the current, staring at the ruins of the mill, the past and the present collapsing into a single unbearable point of agony. Her journey had not been away from her pain, but directly into its gaping, ancient heart. The adventure was over. The reckoning had begun. The millstone of memory. The world constricted to the space between Marilla and the ruined mill. The vast, flowing expanse of the Dnieper, the silent abyssal plains, the churning rapids, all of it fell away, leaving only this bend in the river, this specific stretch of bank, this skeleton of wood and stone. It was a place out of time, a wound in the landscape that mirrored the one festering in her soul. The water here tasted different. It carried the bitter tannin of willow bark and the cloying sweetness of decay, a flavor from the very bottom of her past. She did not dare approach the surface. Instead, she found refuge in the deep shadow cast by the remains of the mill's foundation, a jumble of moss-covered stones that formed a dark grotto on the riverbed. Here, the current was sluggish, burdened with the silt of decades. Pale, blind crayfish scuttled over the detritus, and eels, like living shadows, slithered between the rocks. It was a place of endings, of things forgotten and left to rot.
a fitting sanctuary for the memory that was now unfolding within her, no longer a fragile shard, but a crushing, inescapable weight. Pyotr. The name was no longer a whisper, it was a brand. With it came his face, not as a blurred concept of betrayal, but in hyper-realistic detail. She saw the scattering of freckles across the bridge of his nose, a legacy of long summers working in the sun-flecked fields. She saw the small white scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a trophy from a childhood tumble out of an apple tree. She saw the way his hazel eyes, usually warm with humor, could turn serious and deep, like pools of still water in a forest. She saw the calluses on his hands, the strong, capable hands of a miller's son, hands that had held hers with a tenderness that made her feel both fragile and invincible. The memories unspooled in a relentless, vivid stream, projected onto the dark screen of her mind, the murky water of her present reality. A basket of summer. The sun was a golden coin in a vast, untroubled blue sky. The air hummed with the lazy industry of bees and smelled of clover and warm earth. Marilla, 16 summers old, her feet bare and dusty, walked the familiar path from her family's izba to the mill. In her hands, she carried a woven basket covered with a checkered cloth. Beneath it rested a loaf of dark rye bread, still warm from her mother's oven, and a small clay pot of fresh honey.
She was not the pale specter of the deep, but a girl of flesh and blood, her skin kissed by the sun, her long black braid swinging against her back with each step. She wore a simple linen shift, the color of faded cornflowers, and a string of red coral beads around her neck, a name-day gift from her grandmother. Pyotr was waiting for her, leaning against the sun-warmed wooden wall of the working mill. The great wheel turned with a rhythmic, groaning splash, a sound that was the very heartbeat of their world. He was sharpening a scythe, the scrape of the whetstone a pleasant, metallic rhythm. When he saw her, his face broke into a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made her heart flutter. "Marilla, I was starting to think you'd gotten lost," he said, his voice a warm baritone that fit the summer day perfectly. "And miss the look on your face when you taste this?" she retorted, her own voice light and playful, a sound so alien to the Rusalka she had become, it was like hearing a song from a forgotten country. She held up the basket. "My mother's best loaf. I had to fight my brother for it." He laughed, setting the scythe aside and wiping his hands on his trousers. He took the basket, his fingers brushing against hers. A simple touch, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. He peeked under the cloth. "And honey, you'll spoil me." "Someone has to," she said, smiling. They sat in their spot, in the dappled shade of the old willow tree whose branches trailed in the water, not far from the mill's wheel. They shared the bread, tearing off chunks and dipping them into the golden honey. They talked of simple things, the impending harvest, the new calf born to the village headman's cow, the traveling fair that was due to arrive in the next moon. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart through his rough tunic. In that moment, the world was perfect, a sealed globe of happiness. She could feel the texture of the wool of his sleeve against her cheek, smell the scents of fresh-cut grain and river water on his skin. She felt safe. She felt loved. A promise in the moonlight. Later, on a night when the moon was a sliver of silver, not the baleful eye that now governed her existence, they met again by the mill. The wheel was still, the world quiet, but for the chirping of crickets and the gentle lap of water against the bank. "My father spoke to yours today," Pyotr said, his voice low and serious. He held both her hands in his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. Marilla's breath caught, and he gave his blessing. Pyotr's grin was wide, illuminated by the faint moonlight. "After the harvest," he said, "we can be wed after the harvest."
A joy so profound it was almost painful blossomed in her chest. It was a physical sensation, a warmth that started in her core and spread to the very tips of her fingers. She laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness, and threw her arms around his neck. He spun her around, her feet leaving the ground, the world becoming a whirl of starlight and shadow. "I'll build us a house," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Right there, on the edge of the birchwood, with a window that looks out over the river. We'll fill it with children, Marilla, a whole house full of them." She believed him. With every fiber of her being, she believed him. The promise was as solid as the earth beneath her feet, as eternal as the river flowing beside them. The future was a painted tapestry, bright with color and certainty. The contrast between the searing clarity of these memories and her current desolate reality was a torture more exquisite than any the river could inflict. The warmth of that sun, the solidity of his embrace, the taste of honey and hope, it was all a lie, a beautiful, agonizing lie that had preceded the shattering. The Rusalka, coiled in her dark grotto, let out a sound that was not a song, but a raw, guttural keen of loss. It bubbled up from the silt, a noise that startled the eels and sent the crayfish scrambling for cover. The happiness was the setup, the betrayal was the punchline, and she had been living the joke for decades. Her gray-green eyes, now burning with a cold fire, fixed on the broken mill wheel. The memory of the warm hand, her compass, now felt like a taunt. It was the same hand that had, she was certain, ultimately pushed her. The love had been a pretense, the promise a trick. The question was no longer who, but why. Why had Piotr, whose eyes had held such tender warmth, whose hands had held her with such care, given her to the cold, unforgiving water? What darkness had festered beneath that sun-kissed exterior? The compulsion to know was now a sharper, more desperate hunger than the compulsion to drown. She had found the stage of her tragedy. Now she needed to witness the final act. She needed to remember the fall. She settled into the silt, her gaze locked on the ruins above, a patient predator waiting not for a victim, but for a truth. The weight of the water was nothing compared to the millstone of memory now grinding her spectral heart to dust. The scent of rot and betrayal. Days bled into nights, measured only by the shifting patterns of light that filtered down from the world above. The silver coin of the full moon waned to a sliver, and the oppressive lunar pull that drove the Rusalkas to their haunting diminished, leaving a different kind of tension in the water, a stagnant, waiting quiet. Marilla remained a sentinel in her grotto, a statue carved from sorrow and river sediment. She did not hunt. She did not sing. She barely moved. Her entire being was focused inward, a diver plumbing the blackest depths of her own submerged history. The idyllic memories of summer love and moonlit promises now felt like artifacts from a tomb, beautiful but dead. They had set the stage, making the impending horror all the more profound. She braced herself, waiting for the memory of the fall, for the moment the tapestry of her life was ripped apart. It did not come as a single, catastrophic vision. Instead, it began with a scent. A new current, faint but distinct, wove its way into the familiar tastes of the river. It was the smell of turned earth, of mud churned by many boots, and beneath it, something else, something cloying and sickly sweet. The scent of rot, not the clean decay of river weeds or drowned wood, but the putrid sweetness of spoiled meat and blighted grain. The water carried this foulness to her, and with it, a tremor of dread that had nothing to do with her Rusalka nature. It was a human dread, a ghost of a fear she had felt in her mortal life. The memory, sluggish and reluctant, began to unspool.
A shadow on the harvest. The golden perfection of summer curdled. The sun, once a benevolent god, became a furious eye in a bleached white sky. The air, once humming with life, grew heavy and still, thick with the dust from parched fields. The village held its breath. The harvest was failing. Marilla stood with a group of other women at the edge of the wheat field. The stalks, which should have been tall and golden, heavy with grain, were stunted and tinged with a sinister, rusty brown. A blight. The word was whispered like a curse. Pyotr was there too, his face grim, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His father, the miller, was arguing with the village elder, their voices low and tense. "There is not enough," the elder said, his voice hollow. "Not nearly enough to see us through the winter, not enough to pay the boyar's levy." "The boyar will not care for blight," the miller replied, his voice a low growl. "He will demand his share. He will take his share, even if it leaves us to starve." A cold knot tightened in Marilla's stomach. She looked at Pyotr, seeking reassurance, but found none. His eyes were fixed on the blighted field, his expression a mask of helpless anger. The promise of a wedding, of a house by the birchwood, suddenly seemed foolish, a childish dream, spoken in a time of plenty that had vanished like mist. That night, the atmosphere in the village changed. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by a watchful silence. Doors were barred earlier. The friendly greetings between neighbors became terse nods. Fear was a contagion, and it had infected everyone. She met Pyotr by the mill. The great wheel was still. There was no grain to grind. The silence was unnerving. "What will we do?" Marilla asked, her voice small in the vast, quiet dark. Pyotr would not meet her gaze. He stared into the black water, his profile sharp and strained. "I don't know. My father, he speaks of desperate things." "What things?" "He doesn't say, but he looks at the old ways. He listens to the whispers of the znacharka." The znacharka, the village wise woman who lived in a hut on the outskirts, surrounded by charms and potions. She was both respected and feared. She knew the secrets of herbs, could set a bone or brew a fever tea, but it was also said she knew older, darker lore, how to curse a neighbor's field, how to call upon the things that dwelt in the deep woods and in the river. A superstitious dread, cold and sharp, pricked at Marilla's heart. "The old ways are forbidden," the priest says. "The priest has no food to fill our bellies," Pyotr snapped, turning to her, his eyes blazing with a frustration he had never seen in him before. "What good are his prayers against this? The blight is not of God. It is something else, something that requires a different answer." He took her hands, but his grip was too tight, almost painful. "Don't worry, Marilla. My father will find a way. We will be wed, I promise you." But his promise, once a source of radiant joy, now felt brittle, like ice over a fast-moving stream. The fear in his eyes betrayed the confidence in his words. The whispering woods. The next memory came wrapped in the scent of pine sap and decaying leaves. She was following a narrow, animal track through the deep woods, her heart hammering against her ribs. Pyotr walked ahead of her, his steps sure and silent. He carried a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Are you sure about this, Pyotr?" she whispered,
her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. The trees here were ancient, their branches woven so tightly they blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight. This was the domain of the Lashi, the forest spirit, a place where Christian crosses held no sway. "We have no choice," he muttered, not turning around. "The Znacharka said this is what must be done, an offering, to appease the spirit of the river, to ask for its mercy, to lift the blight." "An offering of what?" Marilla asked, though a part of her dreaded the answer. He didn't reply. They reached a small, dark clearing where a spring, black as ink, bubbled up from between the roots of a giant oak. The Znacharka was there, a hunched figure, swathed in shawls despite the warmth, her face a web of deep wrinkles, her eyes like chips of flint. She took the bundle from Pyotr and unwrapped it. Inside were a handful of the blighted wheat stalks, a dead crow, its feathers lustrous and black, and a small, crudely carved wooden doll. The doll had no face, but its body was wrapped with a few strands of dark hair. Marilla's hair, she realized with a jolt, stolen from her brush. The old woman's gaze fell upon Marilla, and it was like being touched by something cold and dead. "The river is hungry," the Znacharka crooned, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "It is angry. It feels our neglect. It demands a sacrifice of purity, of future promise."
To wash away our impurity. Marilla took a step back, instinct screaming at her to flee. "What are you talking about?" The Znacharka ignored her, turning her flinty eyes to Pyotr. "You know what must be done, miller's son. The old pact. A life for a life. A future for a future. The river takes a bride, and in return it gives its bounty." Pyotr's face was a ghastly white. He looked from the old woman to Marilla, his eyes wide with a terror that was now entirely his own. "No, you said an offering. You didn't say—" "I said what was necessary," the Znacharka hissed. "Do you think the ancient ones are swayed by dead birds and wheat? They want life. They want a soul. The one who was promised to you. The one whose future is brightest. Give her to the river, and the river will bless the village. Your family, your mill will be spared. Refuse, and the blight will consume everything and everyone. There will be nothing left." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Marilla stared at Pyotr, waiting for him to denounce the old woman, to take her hand and run from this evil place. But he just stood there, paralyzed, his shoulders slumping in a gesture of utter defeat. The hope in her heart guttered and died, extinguished by the bleak acceptance in his eyes. The memory shattered there, leaving Marilla gashing in the present, the foul taste of the blighted water and Znacharka's treachery filling her being. The why was now horrifyingly clear. It was not a personal hatred. It was a craven, superstitious bargain. She had been chosen not out of malice, but out of a desperate, cowardly logic. She was the sacrifice, the purest lamb to be slaughtered to appease a hungry God. The love had been real, the promise had been real, but they had been weighed against the survival of the village, against the fear of starvation, and found wanting. Pyotr had not pushed her out of hatred, but out of a weak, terrible human fear. The knowledge did not bring solace. It brought a new, more complex form of agony. The betrayal was somehow deeper, more profound, because it was not born of evil, but of a devastating, relatable weakness. The Rusalka in the grotto curls tighter into herself, the waters around her growing colder still. The final memory, the act itself, was now all that remained,
and she knew with a certainty that froze her spectral blood that she was now strong enough to bear its weight. The giving of the bride. The memory of the forest clearing, with its stink of rotten leaves and darker intentions, had poisoned the water around Marilla. The spectral flesh of her Rusalka form seemed to absorb the lingering miasma of that moment, the terror of the girl she had been becoming, a cold, heavy stone in her own core. The anticipation was a physical pressure, a storm gathering in the silent deep. She knew the final act was near. The threads of her past were drawing taut, leading inexorably to the riverbank, to the moment of her death. The present-day river seemed to cooperate with her grim pilgrimage. The weather in the world above turned. The placid summer sky gave way to bruised purple and gray clouds, and a cold, persistent rain began to fall. It pattered on the surface of the Dnieper, a million tiny drumbeats that created a shimmering, agitated ceiling over Marilla's head. The river level began to rise, its current strengthening, pulling at the reeds and stirring up the silt from the bottom. It was a reenactment, she felt, a spectral echo of that fateful day. The memory did not return us a vision, but us a full sensory immersion. One moment she was a Rusalka coiled in the dark. The next, she was Marilla, the mortal girl, standing in the driving rain, her body trembling, not from the cold, but from a soul-deep horror. The day of the giving. The village was a picture of desolation under the weeping sky. The mud of the single street was a churned brown slurry. The blighted fields lay like a festering wound beside the swollen gray river. There were no children playing, no women chatting at the well. The doors of the izbas were shut tight, their windows dark and vacant like the eyes of the dead. She was being led by the arm. Pyotr was beside her, his grip on her elbow firm, unyielding. His face was a pale, stony mask, all the warmth and humor scoured away by fear and grim resolution. He did not look at her. He stared straight ahead, towards the old mill. "Pyotr, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. The rain plastered her hair to her scalp and ran in cold rivulets down her neck. She wore her best dress, the one she had been saving for her wedding day. It was a simple thing of undyed linen, embroidered at the cuffs and collar with red thread in the old patterns meant to ward off evil. The irony was a sharp knife twisting in her gut. "Don't do this. This is madness."
"It is a sin." "It is necessary," he repeated, the words a hollow mantra. He had been saying them all morning. "For the village, for our families. The Znarkharka has seen it. The river will be appeased. The Znarkharka is a mad old woman. Pyotr, look at me." He flinched, but his gaze remained fixed ahead. They were not alone. From the houses, shadowy figures emerged. The villagers, her neighbors, the people she had grown up with, shared bread with, laughed with. They formed a silent, grim procession behind them. Their faces were a mixture of shame, fear, and a desperate, hungry hope. They averted their eyes from her, but they followed. They were complicit. They were the witnesses. They reached the bank near the mill. The river was high and angry, its surface choppy, its current pulling greedily at the reeds. The Znarkharka stood there, waiting, a dark silhouette against the leaden water. In her hands she held a thick, heavy millstone, a rope already looped through its center. The sight of the stone made Marilla's knees buckle. Pyotr's grip was all that held her up. "No," she sobbed, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, spreading numbness. "No, no, no."
The old woman began to chant, a low, guttural stream of words, in a tongue so ancient it sounded like the earth itself cracking open. It was a prayer to no god Marilla knew, a summons to something old and wet and hungry. The villagers murmured behind her, a sound like the rustling of dead leaves. The Znadharka approached. Her flinty eyes held no pity, only a fanatical certainty. The river must be sure of the gift, she intoned. It must know the bride comes to stay. Pyotr finally turned to her. His eyes, when they met hers, were pools of utter torment. Tears mixed with the rain on his face. "I'm sorry, Marilla," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I have to, for everyone." This was not the strong miller's son who had promised to build her a house. This was a broken boy, terrified of his father, terrified of the village's scorn, terrified of the famine that clawed at the door. In that moment, she saw not a monster, but a fellow victim trapped in a web of superstition and fear. It was this realization that shattered her completely. The Znadharka lashed the rope from the millstone around Marilla's ankles, pulling the knots tight. The coarse hemp bit into her skin. The weight of the stone was an impossible anchor, a promise of the cold, silent dark to come.
"Please, Pyotr," she begged one last time, her voice a mere whisper. All her love, her terror, her betrayal condensed into his name. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, she saw the boy she loved screaming behind his eyes. Then the mask of duty slammed back down. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He pushed her. It was not a violent shove, but a firm, irrevocable press of his hands against her shoulders, a gesture of terrible finality. She stumbled backward, the world tilting. The sky, the rain, the faces of the villagers, Pyotr's agonized expression, it all became a swirling blur. Then the shock. The water was icier than she could have ever imagined. It swallowed her, the cold a fire that stole her breath. The heavy millstone pulled her down instantly, dragging her through the murky water. She fought for a moment, a primal instinct, her limbs flailing, her lungs burning. She looked up. The surface, with its shimmering silver light, receded with terrifying speed. The last thing she saw was the dark, keel-like shape of the boat and the pale, blurred ovals of faces looking down, before the gloom swallowed her. The burning in her lungs became an unbearable agony. She opened her mouth to scream, and the cold, dark water of the Dnieper rushed in, filling her, claiming her. There was a moment of searing pain, a final, frantic spark of consciousness. And then, nothing. Nothing but the cold. Nothing but the weight. Nothing but the dark. The memory ended. The Rusalka, Marilla, uncoiled in her grotto. A silent scream that had been trapped for decades finally erupted from her, a torrent of psychic energy that shook the riverbed. The silt around her boiled, the eels thrashed in a frenzy. The ancient stones of the mill's foundation groaned. She knew. She remembered it all. The love, the fear, the superstition, the weak, heartbreaking betrayal. She had not been murdered by a monster, but sacrificed by a coward. Her life, her future, her love had been bartered away like a sack of grain to appease a phantom. The sorrow that followed this complete knowledge was a bottomless abyss. It was a vast, silent ocean of grief that made the waters of the Dnieper seem shallow. But from the absolute zero of that sorrow, a new emotion began to crystallize. It was not the mindless rage of the Rusalka, the predatory hunger for any warm life. This was colder, sharper, more focused. It was a pure, undiluted, and righteous wrath. Her gray-green eyes opened. no longer clouded with confusion, but clear and hard, like chips of river ice. They fixed upon the village on the bank, the place that had condemned her. They fixed upon the memory of Pyotr, who had been the instrument of her destruction. The lament was over. The reckoning was at hand. She had been given to the river. Now she would become the river's vengeance. The harvest of whispers. The knowing was a cold, clear lake inside her, still and deep, reflecting the full, monstrous truth of her ending. The fragmented, agonizing memories had coalesced into a perfect, terrible picture. There was no more mystery, no more searching. There was only the fact of the millstone, the push, the water, and the betrayal. From the absolute zero of this understanding, a new energy was born. It was not the restless, lunar-driven hunger of the Rusalka. It was a purpose forged in the deepest, darkest fire of her being. The rain continued to fall in the world above, a steady, gray weeping that suited the mood of the riverbed. Marilla uncoiled from her grotto. Her movements were different now. Before, she had drifted, a leaf on the current of her curse. Now she propelled herself, her form cutting through the water with a decisive, muscular grace. The reeds, which had whispered their constant seductive temptations, fell silent as she passed. They seemed to lean away from her, sensing the shift in her nature. She was no longer merely a sister in sorrow. She was a vessel of retribution. Her first target was not Pyotr. He was the center, the heart of the rot, and she would savor his torment. No, the first to be harvested would be the architect, the one who had lit the fuse of this tragedy with her ancient, poisonous words. The znacharka. The old wise woman's hut had been on the bank, not far from the village outskirts. Marilla swam towards it, her senses stretching out, tasting the water for the particular residue of the old woman's presence. The scent of dried mushrooms, bitter herbs, and the faint metallic tang of the charms and amulets that hung from her rafters. She found the place easily, though the hut itself was long gone. Time had washed it away, leaving only a slight depression in the bank and a few blackened, rotten posts protruding from the mud like broken teeth. But the spiritual stain remained. The water here tasted of old magic, a stagnant, selfish power that had long since soured. Marilla settled on the riverbed just offshore, her feet sinking into the soft, silty mud. She closed her eyes, not to remember, but to summon. She reached not into her own past, but into the fabric of the place itself, pulling on the threads of memory and emotion that were woven into the very soil and water. She began to hum, but this was not the beautiful, tragic lure meant to ensnare the living. This was a lower, darker vibration, a sound that churned the silt and made the pebbles on the riverbed tremble. It was a call to the echoes, a command to the shadows that lingered where great suffering had been conceived. The water before her began to swirl, not from the current, but from a force she was generating. Particles of dirt and decay coalesced, drawn together by the power of her focused will and her intimate connection to this specific tragedy. They began to form a shape, a shimmering, semi-transparent figure, woven from muddy water and haunted memory. It was the znacharka, not the living woman, but a vojanoi, a water ghost, a reflection of the old woman's spirit, trapped and bound by the very dark magic she had championed. The figure was hunched and swathed in ethereal shawls, its face a shifting mask of water and shadow, but the flinty, fanatical eyes were unmistakable.
The water ghost tried to speak, its mouth a swirling vortex, but only a gurgle emerged, the sound of a drowning stream. "You remember me." Marilla's voice was not a sound in the water, but a thought, a chill that permeated the specter's form. "You who spoke to the river, you who demanded a bride." The Znachkarka's ghost recoiled, its form rippling. It raised a watery hand as if to ward her off. "You promised a bounty." Marilla's mental voice was a lash of ice. "You promised life in exchange for a life. Look." She gestured with her mind, and the ghost was forced to turn its gaze towards the bank, towards the village that, while changed, still bore the psychic scars of that long-ago famine. The blight ended, but was it your magic? Or did the rains simply turn? They starved anyway, did they not? The winter was hard. The boyar was not merciful. Your bargain was a lie. A desperate lie told by a frightened old woman who wanted to feel powerful. The ghost writhed, a silent scream of denial forming in its fluid throat. "You did not appease the river," Marilla continued, her wrath a calm, relentless tide. "You only added to its sorrow. You made me. And now I have come for your wisdom." She reached out a pale hand, not touching the ghost, but plunging it into the center of the watery form. She was not seeking to harm it physically, such a thing was impossible. She was seeking its knowledge, the entirety of its dark lore. She was going to harvest the very magic that had killed her. A torrent of images and sensations flooded into Marilla. She saw the old woman as a young girl learning forbidden rhymes from her grandmother. She saw the making of poisons and poultices. She saw the secret names of local spirits, the ways to bind them, the prices to be paid. She saw the arrogance, the growing belief that she could manipulate the fundamental forces of the world. And she saw the moment of her own death. Not a dramatic end, but a quiet, lonely passing in her hut, her body undiscovered for days. Her final thought a flicker of doubt about the miller's bride. Marilla absorbed it all, the petty curses, the true healing charms, the rituals for love and for ruin. She learned the language of the earth and the water, not as a supplicant, but as a master. The Znarkarka's ghost began to fade, its essence, its knowledge siphoned away. Its form became thinner, more transparent, its silent screams growing fainter. Finally, with a last feeble swirl, the water ghost dissipated. The last of its consciousness, a final, bitter regret, was absorbed into Marilla's being. The water where it had stood was clear once more. Marilla withdrew her hand. She felt heavier, denser. The simple, vengeful rage of the Rusalka was now augmented by the intricate, calculated understanding of the Znarkarka. She knew now that the old magic was real. It was a thread in the tapestry of the world, and she had just pulled it free. She turned her gaze from the empty bank towards the sleeping village. The rain was easing, the first light of dawn a thin, gray line on the horizon. The villagers were still there, the descendants of those who had watched her be given to the water. They had believed the old magic could save them. Now they would learn that it could also curse them. Her education was complete. The harvest of her vengeance was ready to begin, and she would start, not with a drowning, but with a whisper. A whisper that would slither under their doors and into their dreams. A whisper that would remind them of the price of a life and the long, long memory of the river. The sowing of salt and sorrow. Dawn broke over the village, not with a golden triumph, but with a weary, gray surrender.
The rain had ceased, leaving the world sodden and gleaming. Every leaf and blade of grass bowed under the weight of clinging droplets. The air was fresh-washed and cold, carrying the rich, loamy scent of wet earth. To the villagers stirring from their sleep, it was the smell of a new day. To Marilla, watching from the shallows with her new, ancient knowledge, it was the smell of a freshly turned grave. Her confrontation with the Znahurka's ghost had changed her. The mindless fury had been refined in the crucible of that stolen lore, transmuted into something far more potent and patient. She was no longer a mere instrument of the river's hunger. She was a weaver of fates, a composer of a symphony of despair. Her vengeance would not be a single catastrophic flood. It would be a slow, creeping frost, a blight of the spirit to mirror the blight of the field that had started it all. She began that morning as the first tendrils of smoke curled from the village chimneys. Her voice, when she used it, was no longer a melodic lure. It was the sound of the reeds themselves, a dry, sibilant whisper that rode on the morning breeze. She did not project words, but ideas, impressions seeded directly into the subconscious minds of the sleeping and the waking. She targeted the descendants of those who had stood on that bank, their collective guilt a fertile soil for her poison. To the baker, a great-grandson of the village elder who had sanctioned the sacrifice, she sent a dream of his ovens growing cold, of his dough refusing to rise, remaining a dead, pasty lump no matter how he kneaded it. He woke with a start, the phantom smell of raw, unbaked flour clinging to his nostrils. To the young mother, whose grandmother had been one of the silent women in the procession, Marilla sent a chill, a deep anxiety about the village well. The woman awoke with a sudden, irrational conviction that the water was tainted, that it would bring a wasting sickness to her baby. She would spend her day boiling water frantically, her eyes darting towards the well with superstitious dread. To the currant miller, a distant cousin of Piotr's line who now operated a newer mill upstream, she sent a different kind of whisper. It was the sound of grinding stones, not crushing grain, but scraping against each other with a teeth-jarring shriek, the sound of machinery tearing itself apart. He went to his mill that morning uneasy, examining his gears and shafts for a fault he would never find. These were not attacks of physical harm, they were inoculations of unease, tiny fractures in the foundation of their daily peace. Marilla, nestled among the roots of the willows, her form half buried in the silt, conducted this psychic assault with a chilling precision. The Znahurka's knowledge had given her a map of the village's spiritual anatomy, and she pressed upon its pressure points with a surgeon's cold skill. But this was only the prelude. The main performance required a more tangible focus. Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, fell upon the village's small plot of land, the field where the new season's crops were just beginning to sprout, tender green shoots of barley and cabbage emerging from the dark, wet soil. This was their lifeblood, their hope, the same hope that had been valued above her own. She waited until the sun was high, a pale, watery coin behind the thinning clouds. The villagers were about their business, but a palpable tension hung in the air. The baker had burned the first batch of bread. The young mother's frantic boiling had caused her to scorch a pot of porridge, filling her isba with the smell of smoke and failure. The miller's anxiety had made him short-tempered, snapping at his apprentice. The whispers were taking root. Marilla extended a pale, slender hand from the water, resting her fingertips on the damp earth of the bank. She closed her eyes, not calling upon the river's power, but upon the deeper, older magic she had harvested from the Znahurka, the magic of the soil, of growth and decay. She began to hum, a low, resonant thrum that was felt rather than heard, a vibration that traveled through the earth itself.
It was a song of negation, a chord of blight. She poured the memory of her own ending into the soil, the cold, the darkness, the suffocation, the betrayal. She visualized the life leaving her body and transforming into a sterile, killing chill. Where her fingers touched the mud, a change began. The vibrant, rich brown of the earth leached of its color, turning a sickly, grayish white. It was as if a wave of invisible frost was radiating from her touch, spreading through the soil towards the field. The phenomenon was slow, insidious.
It did not kill the plants outright. That would be too quick, too simple. Instead, the tender green shoots of barley began to grow at an unnerving, twisted rate. Their stalks became spindly and pale, their heads malformed, producing not plump kernels of grain, but a black, sooty chaff. The cabbage leaves, once broad and waxy, curled in upon themselves, becoming tough and bitter, their veins tracing a map of poison in livid purple. It was a mimicry of the original blight, but this was no natural disease. This was a curse, a deliberate perversion of life. The plants grew, but they grew wrong. Their very essence corrupted by the sorrow and wrath Marilla channeled into the earth. The field, from a distance, still looked green, but up close it was a monument to aberration, a garden of despair. She withdrew her hand. The effort left her feeling hollow, not drained, but satisfied. The connection broke, and the patch of earth beneath her fingers remained bleached and dead, a permanent scar of her touch. A boy, sent to check on the field by his worried father, was the first to see it. He saw the strangely tall, pale barley swaying in a breeze that wasn't there. He touched a cabbage leaf and it felt like rough, cold leather. He ran back to the village, his face white with a confusion that was deeper than fear. By evening, the entire village knew. They stood at the edge of the field, a silent, horrified crowd. They saw the blighted plants. They smelled the faint, sweetish odor of rot that hung over the rows. This was not a simple pest or a lack of rain. This was something else, something unnatural. The old stories, which had faded into half-remembered folklore, began to stir in their minds. They looked from the twisted crops to the swollen gray river, its surface deceptively calm. The first voice, trembling and old, spoke what they all were thinking. The river, it is displeased. Another, a woman, crossed herself. The miller's bride. The words hung in the damp air, a specter more tangible than any ghost. They had not spoken of it in generations. They had buried the shame, hoping the river had buried the memory. They were wrong. Marilla, listening from the depths, felt their fear ripple through the water. It was a nourishing thing, a balm on the raw wound of her existence. This was only the beginning. She had sown salt and sorrow into their field. Now, she would wait for the harvest of their terror to ripen. The stage was set. The next actor, the one for whom this entire symphony was composed, would have to take his place soon. Pyotr, the miller's son, the man who had pushed her. He was the key that would unlock the final, devastating movement. The old man and the river. The blight upon the field was a poison that seeped from the soil into the very soul of the village. The initial shock curdled into a low, humming panic. The twisted barley and bitter cabbages were a daily, visible reminder that the past was not dead, but merely sleeping in the deep, and it had now awakened, hungry and vengeful. The name Miller's Bride
once a shameful secret whispered by the oldest generation, was now on the lips of every villager, spoken with a tone of dread that bordered on reverence. It was in this atmosphere of mounting fear that the current elder, a pragmatic man named Grigori, made a decision. The old ways had failed them once, leading to a terrible crime. The church, for all its comfort, had no prayer to untwist a stalk of barley. There was only one person left who might understand the nature of this affliction, one who carried the living memory of that time. He was the last, fragile thread connecting the present horror to its origin. Pyotr, the man who had pushed her. He lived not in the village proper, but in a small, isolated izba a quarter-mile upstream, nestled between the river and the edge of the deep woods. He had withdrawn from community life decades earlier, after the death of his wife, becoming a reclusive figure, a subject of pity and vague unease. The villagers brought him food and mended his roof when needed, but they did so out of a sense of obligation laced with superstition. They feared the ghosts that haunted him, knowing one of them was of his own making. Grigori, with two other stout-hearted men for moral support, made the walk to Pyotr's dwelling. The path was overgrown, and the air here was colder, the silence heavier, broken only by the relentless sigh of the river. The izba was a sorry sight, its logs gray with age and moisture, the roof sagging like a tired spine. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb waiting for its occupant. Grigori knocked on the warped wooden door. After a long moment, it creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness and a single pale blue eye, watery and deeply sunken in a web of wrinkles.
"Pyotr Ivanovitch," Grigori said, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet. "We must speak with you. It is about the village." The door opened wider. Pyotr stood there, a stooped and brittle figure, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. He was wraith-thin, his clothes hanging from his frame. His hair, what little remained, was a wispy white cloud. But it was his face that held the men transfixed. It was a landscape of sorrow. Deep grooves were carved from his nose to the corners of his mouth, and his eyes held a permanent, weary anguish, a look of a man who had been staring into a fire of his own regrets for 50 years. He did not speak, merely stepped back, granting them entry with a slow, resigned wave of his hand. The inside of the hut was as sparse and somber as its owner. A cold hearth, a rough-hewn table, a single stool, and a narrow bed piled with threadbare blankets. The only object of any note was a small, crudely carved wooden icon of a saint, its features smoothed by time and anxious touch. The air smelled of dust, dried herbs, and the profound, metallic scent of old grief. "Pyotr Ivanovitch," Grigori began again, his voice softer now, filled with the gravity of the situation. "There is a trouble upon us, a blight on the field, not like any we have seen. The plants, they grow, but they grow wrong, twisted, black." One of the other men, a younger farmer named Nikolai, blurted out, "It is the river's doing, the miller's bride. They say she has returned." At the mention of the miller's bride, Pyotr flinched as though struck. His knuckles, gripping his staff, turned white. He closed his eyes, his Adam's apple bobbing in his scrawny throat. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, a sound of utter defeat. "Marila," he whispered. The name was a prayer and a curse, spoken so softly it was almost lost in the stagnant air of the hut. Grigori leaned forward. "You knew her, Pyotr. You were there. What was done? The old stories, they are unclear. Why would she? Why now?"
Pyotr's eyes opened, and they were focused on a point in the far distance, looking through the walls of the hut, through the years, to the rain-lashed bank and the gray, hungry water. "It was the famine," he began, his voice a dry rustle. "The blight, the Znaharka. She said the river was angry. She demanded a sacrifice, a bride." His voice broke on the word. "A life for the lives of the village." The men listened, their own fears confirmed, the old sin laid bare in the dim light. "My father, he was afraid. The whole village was afraid. He trailed off, his shoulders slumping further, if that were possible. "I was a boy, a frightened boy. They told me it was my duty, that it was the only way." He looked at Grigori, his eyes pleading, desperate for an understanding he had never granted himself. "I loved her. I was to marry her, and I gave her to the water." The confession hung in the room, a toxic fog. The men were silent, overwhelmed by the sheer, stark horror of it. It was one thing to hear a ghost story. It was another to hear the ghost's murderer, now a broken old man, speak the truth of it. "What can be done?" Grigori asked, his voice hushed. "Is there an appeasement? A way to set it right?" Pyotr gave a slow, hopeless shake of his head. "There is no setting it right. There is only the weight. I have carried it every day since. I hear her, sometimes, in the river at night, a song. A single tear traced a path through the canyons on his cheek. She is not singing for me to come to her. She is singing for me to remember." His gaze shifted towards the single, small window that looked out over the river. "She is here. She has been waiting. Not for the village, for me." The conversation ended soon after. The men left the hut, their spirits heavier than when they arrived. They had not found a solution, only the source. The curse had a name and a face and a heartbroken old man at its center. Back in the depths, Marilla had felt it all. She had felt the tremor of their fear, the vibration of their footsteps on the path to Pyotr's door. And she had felt the seismic shock of her own name on his lips. Marilla. He remembered. He had carried the weight, just as she had carried the millstone. But his weight had not held him under the water. It had held him in a life of solitary penance. The knowledge did not quell her wrath, but it complicated it, adding a new, bitter flavor to her vengeance. He was not a monster living in blissful ignorance. He was a man who had been slowly devoured by his own act, a living ghost in his own right. Her focus sharpened to a razor's point. The village, the blighted field, the frightened whispers, they were the backdrop. The main drama was now between her and the old man in the hut by the river. The push had been the beginning. The pull would be the end. She would not drag him down in a frantic, terrified struggle. She would call to him, and he would come to her, a willing penitent walking into the cold, dark church of his own making. The stage was now his alone, and she, the director and the congregation, waited in the watery wings. The first note of the final song. The visit from the village elders left a new silence in its wake within Pyotr's hut, a silence thicker and more profound than the solitary quiet that had preceded it. It was the silence of a verdict being read, of a final, dreaded diagnosis confirmed. The specter of his youth, which had haunted the periphery of his life for 5 decades, had now stepped fully into the center of the room, its breath cold on the back of his neck. Marilla, not a fading memory, but an active, vengeful force. The twisted crops were her handwriting, a message from the deep written in a language of blight and sorrow. He did not sleep that night. He sat on his stool by the cold hearth, his gnarled hands resting on his knees, his body trembling with a fine, constant vibration that was more than chill or age. It was the tremor of a soul stripped bare. The confession he had made to Grigori had torn open a wound that had never truly healed, only festered beneath a scar of quiet resignation. Now it bled freely, and the pain was a shocking, vivid thing, sharper than he remembered. He saw her face not us, the pale water wraith of legend, but us as it was in life, the bright, intelligent eyes, the smile that could light the dimmest corner of the mill, the way a stray lock of her dark hair would always escape her braid to curl against her cheek. He felt the ghost of her hand in his, the warmth of her shoulder under his arm as they sat by the river. The happiness, which he had spent a lifetime trying to forget, now returned to him with the force of a physical blow, a beautiful, agonizing torture. It made what came after all the more monstrous. The memory of the Znacharka's hut, the weight of the millstone in his hands, the feel of her shoulders under his palms as he pushed, these images flashed behind his eyes, bright and terrible like lightning strikes. He had told the elders he was a frightened boy. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. Beneath the fear had been a bitter, shameful seed of resentment. The burden of saving the village, of being the one to make the terrible choice, had felt like an immense, unfair weight. The memory of the Znacharka's hut, the weight of the millstone in his hands, the feel of her shoulders under his palms as he pushed, these images flashed behind his eyes, bright and terrible like lightning strikes. He had told the elders he was a frightened boy. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. Beneath the fear had been a bitter, shameful seed of resentment. The burden of saving the village, of being the one to make the terrible choice, had felt like an immense, unfair weight. For one fleeting, hateful moment, us he pushed. That resentment had eclipsed his love, his terror, his very humanity. In that moment, he had not been a victim of the village's fear. He had been its willing executioner. This was the knowledge that had truly eaten him alive all these years. Not just that he had killed her, but that a part of him, however small and transient, had wanted to be free of the burden she represented. Alai Islam, the deepest part of the night settled over the world. The time when the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest, he heard it. It started not as a sound, but as a pressure change in the air, a subtle tuning of the silence. Then it came, drifting from the river, slipping under his door and through the cracks in the wall. A song. It was not the beautiful, tragic lure the villagers whispered about, the one that promised comfort and love. This was different. It was lower, older, a melody that seemed to be woven from the flow of the current itself and the groaning of the drowned trees on the riverbed. There were no words, yet it communicated with a terrifying clarity. It was a song of memory. It carried the taste of wild strawberries, the scent of sun-warmed linen, the feeling of rough bark against a young back, the dizzying whirl of being spun in strong arms. It was their story, the happy part played back to him, note by perfect, heartbreaking note. Pyotr bowed his head, tears streaming down his face, dripping from his chin onto his worn trousers. The song was not an attack. It was an accusation woven from the very fabric of their lost joy. It was Marilla showing him the treasure he had shattered, reminding him of the value of what he had destroyed. The melody played for what felt like an eternity, holding him captive in a prison of his own happiest memories. Then, slowly, it began to change. The notes grew colder, the rhythm faltered. The warmth of the sun was replaced by the chill of rain. The scent of strawberries soured into the smell of wet stone and fear. The joyful melody twisted, incorporating the discordant chant of the Znaharka, the terrified beat of his own heart, the final, gasping intake of breath before the water claimed her. The song became her drowning. He could feel it, the shocking cold, the burning in the lungs, the terror, the betrayal, the crushing weight of the millstone pulling her down into the endless, silent dark. The music did not simply describe it, it was it.
He was experiencing her death from the inside, feeling the life leave her body, feeling her consciousness transform from a vibrant, loving girl into a cold, eternal thing of wrath and sorrow. He cried out, a ragged, animal sound, clapping his hands over his ears. But it was useless. The song was not in the air, it was in his mind, in his blood, in the marrow of his bones. It was the echo of the push, amplified and given voice. When the song finally ceased, the silence that returned was deafening, a void left by the retreating tide of sound. Pyotr was left shattered, hunched over on his stool, gasping for air as if he himself had been drowning. The hut was freezing cold, his breath pluming in the moonlight air, though the hearth had been dead for hours. He knew, with a certainty that brooked no argument, that this had only been the first verse. This had been her proof, her evidence laid before the court of his soul. She had shown him the crime in its full, horrific context. The sentence was yet to be pronounced. He stumbled to his feet, his joints screaming in protest, and shuffled to the window. The river lay under the moonlight, a ribbon of polished obsidian, its surface deceptively calm. He could feel her presence there, a concentration of cold intent in the deep. She was waiting. She had sung him the story of their past. The next song, he feared, would be the story of his future. And he knew, with a weary, final resignation, that he would have to go to her. The debt, 50 years overdue, was now being called in. The first note of the final song had been sung, and he was the only one who could provide the last. The penitent's vigil. The song did not return the next night, nor the night after. This silence was a torture more exquisite than the melody had been. The memory of the music was etched into Pyotr's nerves, a permanent, low-level hum of anguish that colored every waking moment and poisoned his fitful sleep. He would startle awake, convinced he heard the first faint notes drifting from the river, only to be met with a quiet broken only by the crickets and the wind in the trees. The anticipation was a blade twisting slowly in a wound she had opened. He stopped performing the simple rituals that had structured his solitude. He no longer bothered to light the stove, existing on cold porridge and the last of the hardened bread from the village. He did not bother to wash. The grime on his skin and clothes, a fitting counterpart to the filth he felt within. His world had shrunk to the four walls of his hut and the view from his single window, a rectangle of landscape dominated by the river, which now seemed to him a living, watching entity. He began to talk to her. At first, it was mere thoughts, desperate, silent pleas sent towards the water. "I'm sorry. Forgive me. I was a fool, a coward." But the words felt hollow, dust in the wind. Their insufficiency drove him to speak aloud, his voice a dry, cracking thing in the empty hut. "I remember the strawberries, Marilla," he whispered to the setting sun, his forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window. "The ones we found in the clearing. You stained your fingers red, and you laughed so much." A day later, as a slow, cold rain began to fall, his tone shifted, becoming more confessional. "My father,
He did not force me. He looked at me, and his eyes were so full of fear. He said, "The village will die, son. We will all die. You can save us." He made it a choice, a terrible choice. And I chose wrong. I chose to be a hero in their eyes rather than a man in yours. The following evening, under a sliver of moon that felt like a mocking celestial smile, the true depth of his self-loathing surfaced. "It wasn't just fear," he confessed to the darkness, his voice thick with tears. "For a moment, just a moment, I was angry. Angry at you for being the one who had to be chosen. Angry that my happy future was the price. I hated the burden. I hated it. And in that hate, I pushed. May God forgive me, Marilla. A part of me wanted to push." This admission, spoken aloud into the silent, judging night, left him gasping as if he had vomited up a piece of his own rotten soul. He expected a response, a sudden gust of wind, a freezing of the air, a resurgence of the song. But there was nothing, only the patient, endless flow of the river. Her silence was not forgiveness. It was a verdict of profound indifference. His confessions were not absolving him. They were merely the required prelude. The physical world began to reflect his inner decay. A patch of black, glistening mold spread across the wall nearest the river, its pattern disturbingly reminiscent of a woman's flowing hair. The water from his bucket, drawn from his own small well, developed a faint, brackish taste, a persistent reminder of the river's proximity. One morning, he found a single dead crow on his doorstep, its feathers sleek and wet, one of its black eyes staring up at him with a knowing emptiness. He was being surrounded. Slowly, patiently, she was closing the walls of his prison, making his existence a perfect mirror of her own, cold, isolated, and defined solely by the memory of his crime. On the fifth night of his vigil, the compulsion became physical. It was not a sound or a vision, but a pull, a deep, magnetic yearning that originated in his bones. He had to go to the river, not to the bank near the village, but to their place, the old mill. He did not bother with a coat. He took his walking stick. His hand trembling so violently, the knotted wood tapped a frantic, staccato rhythm on the hard-packed earth of his floor. He opened the door and stepped out into the night. The air was bitingly cold, and a thick, spectral mist had risen from the water, coiling through the trees like a congregation of ghosts. The world was monochrome, painted in shades of gray and black, the moon a smudged fingerprint behind the haze. His progress was slow, a funeral march with only one mourner. Every step was an effort, a fight against a lifetime of running from this moment. The path was familiar, etched into his muscle memory from 10,000 journeys in his youth. He passed the place where they had first kissed. He passed the tree where they had carved their initials, the letters now swollen and blurred by decades of growth, a scar on the living wood. Finally, he saw it. The ruins of the mill stood before him, a black skeleton against the slightly less black sky. The broken wheel was a jagged outline, a monument to industry and life brought to a permanent halt. The mist was thickest here, clinging to the ground and swirling around the rotting posts, making the very air feel dense and liquid. He stopped at the water's edge, his breath catching in his chest. This was the spot. He knew it with a certainty that transcended memory. The specific curve of the bank, the way the old willow's branches trailed in the water. This was where he had stood. This where she had stood, her eyes wide with disbelief and terror. This was where he had placed his hands on her and ended the world. He sank to his knees in the wet grass, the cold seeping instantly through the threadbare fabric of his trousers. The pull from the water was overwhelming now, a siren call that resonated with the part of him that longed for an end to the pain, for the silence of the deep. "I am here, Marilla," he said, his voice a raw whisper that was swallowed by the mist. "I have come." He waited, his entire body trembling, his heart a frantic, trapped bird in the cage of his ribs. He stared into the black, opaque water, expecting to see her pale form rise, to see the deathly face of the Rusalka he had created. But the surface of the river remained unbroken. There was no song, no apparition. Instead, a single, perfect water lily, impossibly white in the gloom, floated to the surface a few feet from the bank. It was pristine, its petals unfurled around a golden center, a vision of serene beauty in this place of decay. It drifted gently, coming to a stop directly in front of him. It was a message, a symbol of the purity he had destroyed, an offer of something beautiful and peaceful that was forever out of his reach, existing just beyond the line where his world ended and hers began. It was her final, silent answer to all his desperate words. He understood. Forgiveness was not hers to give. Absolution was not possible. His vigil was not for atonement. It was for bearing witness. He was to sit in the cold and the dark on the very spot of his crime and look upon the beauty he had murdered and know, for the rest of his numbered nights, that he could never have it back. Pyotr, the old man, bowed his head, his tears falling silently into the grass. The penitent's vigil had begun, and he knew, with a soul-crushing certainty, that it would only end when he found the courage to step forward from the bank and reclaim the gift he had given to the water half a century before.
The child at the water's edge. The village, gripped by a fear that was both superstitious and viscerally real, began to turn in on itself like a wounded animal. The blighted field stood us a daily, silent accusation. The story of Pyotr's confession, whispered from mouth to mouth, had transformed the historical tragedy into a present and active threat. The river was no longer a source of life and a means of travel. It was a fickle, vengeful god that demanded a reverence bordering on terror. This atmosphere of dread was a palpable force, a miasma that even the children could not escape. They were kept from playing near the banks, their mothers pulling them sharply back from the water's edge with hissed warnings and frantic signs of the cross. The river song, which had once been a mere ghost story to thrill and frighten them on dark nights, was now discussed in hushed, serious tones by the adults. It had become real. But children, with their unformed intuition and lack of regard for the grim logic of their elders, often perceive the world through a different lens. One such child was Anya, the 7-year-old daughter of Nikolai, the farmer who had accompanied Grigory to Pyotr's hut. She was a quiet, observant girl with wide, thoughtful eyes the color of the summer sky and a mess of flaxen hair that refused to be tamed by braids. While the other children heeded the warnings, their fear a sharp, immediate thing, Anya felt a different pull. The forbidden river, now shrouded in such terrifying mystery, held a fascination for her. She did not sense the predatory wrath the adults whispered about. Instead, from her small window at night, she would listen to the sound of the current, and she heard not a threat, but a profound, bottomless sadness. It was a feeling she recognized, a loneliness that echoed her own when she had no one to play with. Several days after Pyotr began his lonely vigil at the old mill, Anya found herself wandering away from the cluster of izbas during the late afternoon.
She followed a path of her own making, drawn by an impulse she could not name, until the sounds of the village faded behind her, and she stood at a secluded part of the bank, downstream from the cursed field and the old mill. Here, the river widened into a calm, deep pool, shaded by ancient alder trees whose roots formed gnarled, intricate cages in the water. She sat on a thick, moss-covered root, her small feet dangling just above the surface of the water.
The air was still and cool. She skipped a flat stone, watching it hop 3 times before sinking into the dark, green depths. "Hello?" she called out softly, her voice small against the vast, quiet murmur of the river. There was no answer, of course, only the plaintive cry of a distant bird and the gentle lap of water against the shore. But beneath the surface, something stirred. Marilla had been aware of the child's approach. The vibration of small, light footsteps on the bank was a different frequency from the heavy, fearful tread of the adults. This was not the frantic, delicious thrum of a terrified heart, but a gentle, curious patter. She had risen from the silt, intrigued, and drifted silently towards the pool, her form hidden in the deep shadows cast by the alder roots. She watched the little girl from below, a pale specter in the dappled gloom. The child's face, seen through the warping lens of the water, was open and unafraid. There was a light about her, a simple, uncomplicated vitality that had not yet been scarred by the world's cruelty. It was a light that should have provoked Marilla's rage, a reminder of the life stolen from her. But instead, it evoked a different, more complicated emotion, a strange, protective curiosity. Anya, feeling a presence but seeing nothing, began to talk. It was the one-sided, rambling conversation of a lonely child. "My name is Anya. My papa says I mustn't come here. He says the lady in the river is angry. Did someone be mean to you?" Marilla remained still, listening. The direct, innocent question pierced through layers of wrath and sorrow. "My grandmama says you were very pretty," Anya continued, pulling a leaf from the water and examining it. "She says you had hair like a raven's wing. My hair is yellow, like straw." She made a face. "I don't like the field anymore. The plants are all sick and scary. Papa says we might be hungry this winter." The mention of the blight, from this child's perspective, held no accusation, only a simple statement of worry. Marilla felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a twinge of conscience. This child had done nothing. Her only crime was being born into the lineage of those who had wronged her. Slowly, carefully, Marilla extended a single pale hand from the water, just beneath the surface. She did not break the plane, but let her fingers hover, visible as a shimmering white shape in the green water, like a strange, beautiful water lily. Anya's eyes widened. She leaned forward, not in fear, but in wonder. "Oh," she breathed, "are you the lady?" Marilla willed a response. She did not sing, did not speak. Instead, she focused on the water around her submerged hand. Tiny bubbles, like strings of silver pearls, began to rise from her fingertips. They swirled and danced in the current, catching the filtered sunlight and glittering like diamonds. It was a simple, beautiful magic, a display of harmless wonder. Anya giggled, a sound of pure, delighted joy that rang like a crystal bell in the quiet air. It was a sound that had not been heard on that bank for 50 years. The laughter struck Marilla with the force of a physical blow. It was so alien, so antithetical to her entire existence, that it created a fissure in the ice of her being.
For a fleeting second, the cold weight of the millstone, the memory of the choking water, the bitter taste of betrayal, all of it receded, replaced by the simple, radiant sound of a child's happiness. She let her hand sink back into the darkness, the bubble show ending. "That was pretty," Anya called out. "Will you do it again tomorrow?" From the deep, Marilla sent a feeling, not a thought, a gentle, affirmative pressure in the air, a sensation of a nodded head. A voice, sharp with panic, cut through the trees from further up the bank. "Anya! Anya, where are you? Get away from the water!" It was her father, Nikolai. Anya jumped up, her moment of magic broken. "I have to go," she whispered to the water, "but I'll come back, I promise." She turned and scampered off towards the sound of her father's voice, leaving the bank once again in silence. Marilla sank back into the depths, her mind a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. The encounter had lasted only minutes, but it had shaken the foundation of her purpose. The child, Anya, was an innocent, a thread of life completely unconnected to the old sin. In her, Marilla saw not a target for vengeance, but a fragile, potential future. The old, familiar wrath still burned, a cold fire demanding Pyotr's end, demanding the village's continued terror. But now a new, fragile seed had been planted beside it, a seed of something that felt dangerously like mercy. The path of vengeance, which had seemed so clear and justified, was now bifurcated. To continue her harvest of sorrow, she would have to tread upon this innocent light. The choice, once simple, had become unthinkably complex.
The Rusalka's journey was no longer just about the past. It was now inextricably linked to the future. The fractured wrath. The silence of the deep, once a comforting shroud, now felt like a cacophony of conflicting voices. Marilla drifted in the abyssal plain near the sunken galley, the ghostly fungi casting a pulsating, sickly light that did little to illuminate the turmoil within her. The memory of Anya's laughter echoed in the water-filled chambers of her mind, a sound so pure it was a physical ache, a warmth that threatened to thaw the permafrost of her being. For 50 years, her existence had been a monolith of sorrow and rage. Every thought, every impulse, every note of her song had been filtered through the lens of her betrayal. It was a clean, simple, and terrible geometry. The living had warmth. She had cold. They had joy. She had vengeance. They were the cause. She was the effect. Anya had introduced a variable the equation could not accommodate: innocence. The child's face, her unguarded curiosity, her simple offer of companionship, it was a key that fit a lock Marilla had forgotten she possessed. It unlocked a memory of herself not as a victim or a monster, but as a girl who had also loved skipping stones and who had found wonder in the dappled light of the forest. The part of her that was still Marilla, the mortal girl, stirred in its watery grave, responding to the call of a kindred spirit. But the Rusalka, the entity born of drowning and despair, would not relinquish its dominion so easily. Its voice was the voice of the millstone, cold and absolute. "She is of their blood," it whispered in the currents, "the seed of those who watched you die. Let her laughter turn to screams. Let her hope be the first thing you drown. It will make your vengeance complete." These two forces warred within her, a silent, brutal civil war in the depths. She felt herself fracturing, pulled in two impossible directions. To spare the child was to betray the core of her own tragedy, to invalidate half a century of righteous wrath. To harm the child was to become a monster in truth,
to extinguish a light that had, for a fleeting moment, made the crushing pressure of the deep feel a little less absolute. The following day, as the sun reached its zenith, she felt the familiar, gentle vibration of small footsteps on the bank of the alder pool. Anya had returned. Marilla remained hidden, coiled in the shadows beneath the tangled roots.
She watched the girl settle on her mossy throne, her small legs kicking back and forth over the water. "Hello, lady," Anya called, her voice hopeful. "I brought you something." From the pocket of her simple smock, the child produced a small, slightly squashed wildflower, a blue cornflower. It was a humble thing, but it was a gift, an offering of peace from the world of the living to the world of the dead. "I'm sorry about the field," Anya continued, her tone turning somber. "Papa says we might have to leave, go to my uncle's village, far away. I don't want to go. I like it here. I like talking to you." The words "leave" and "far away" sent a surprising jolt of panic through Marilla. The thought of the bank being empty, of the gentle vibrations ceasing, of the laughter never returning, was a new kind of desolation. It was a loneliness far more profound than the one she had known before, because now she had tasted its opposite. The Rusalka within her seized on this. "See, they will flee, they will scatter like rats, and your vengeance will be left unfinished. The old man will die alone in his hut, and you will be cheated of your reckoning. This child is their unwitting shield. Remove the shield." Driven by this renewed spike of fury, Marilla acted. She did not rise, but she focused her will on the water around Anya's dangling feet. The temperature plummeted. A thin, crystalline skin of ice began to form at the edges of the pool, creeping inward with unnatural speed. The cheerful babbling of the water stilled, replaced by an ominous, expanding silence. The very light seemed to dim, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. Anya felt the change immediately. She stopped kicking, her smile vanishing. She looked down at the water, her eyes wide. The playful green pool was turning into a pit of black, freezing glass. A deep, primal fear, the kind her parents had tried to instill, finally took root in her heart. "Lady," she stammered, her voice small and scared. She pulled her feet up, hugging her knees to her chest. From the depths, Marilla saw the fear on the child's face. She felt the triumphant surge of the Rusalka's power. This was it. This was the moment to claim this piece of the village's future, to make them mourn a child as she had been mourned. But then she saw the cornflower. It had fallen from Anya's lap and lay on the moss, a tiny, brilliant speck of blue against the encroaching gray and white. A gift. Freely given. A gesture with no motive other than kindness. The memory of the warm hand, her hand, Marilla's hand, clasping Pyotr's, flashed before her. The memory of offering him bread and honey. The memory of giving her love freely and completely. The war inside her climaxed. The Rusalka's wrath and the girl's mercy were two tidal waves crashing into each other. With a soundless, internal scream of effort, Marilla wrenched her power back. The creeping ice halted. Then, with a series of soft, cracking sighs, it began to recede, melting away as quickly as it had formed. The muted colors of the bank returned, the light warmed, and the gentle lapping of the water started again. The threatening stillness was broken. Anya, trembling, watched the ice vanish. The fear in her eyes did not disappear, but it was now mixed with confusion. The danger had been real, she had felt it, a cold, hungry presence.
But it had retreated. Why? Marilla, exhausted by the internal battle, remained hidden. She had not revealed herself. She had not harmed the child. But she had shown a fraction of her power, and she had shown mercy. It was a stalemate. A painful, fragile, and utterly confusing stalemate. Anya slowly uncurled herself. She looked at the water for a long time, then at the forgotten cornflower. She did not pick it up. Without another word, she slid off the root and backed away from the bank before turning and running towards the village. Marilla was left alone in the pool, the victory feeling like a defeat and the defiance feeling like a failure. She had preserved the child's light, but in doing so, she had betrayed the dark purpose that had given her form. She was no longer a perfect engine of vengeance. She was fractured. She was confused. And she knew, with a dread that was entirely new, that the final confrontation with Pyotr would now be infinitely more complex. For how could she demand a life for a life when she herself had just proven unequivocally that she was still capable of granting mercy? The weight of a cornflower. The retreat of the ice had been a victory for the ghost of the girl, but it left the Rusalka feeling gutted, a fortress with its central keep suddenly vacant. The cold, clear purpose that had sustained her for decades was now clouded, its sharp edges blunted by an act of mercy that felt, in its own way, like a profound self-betrayal.
She drifted away from the alder pool, not with the decisive propulsion of before, but with the listless motion of seaweed torn from its anchor. She found herself drawn back to the grove of drowned willows, the place that had been her first home in death. The reeds here, sensing her return, began their old whispers, "Drown, come drown." But their voices now seemed crude, simplistic, the prattling of simple-minded children compared to the symphony of conflict now raging within her. She swept a hand through a dense cluster, and instead of pulsing with a vengeful green light, they withered instantly, turning black and brittle, their whispers dying in a final dry rattle. She had rejected their fundamental premise. The encounter with Anya had changed the very physics of her existence. Before, her power was a direct conduit from her pain to its manifestation. Now, there was a resistor in the circuit, a conscience. To summon the deep cold, to twist the growth of a plant, to sing the drowning song, she would first have to push past the memory of a child's trusting eyes and the image of a single blue cornflower lying abandoned on the moss. She tried to focus on Pyotr, to stoke the embers of her wrath for him. She pictured him kneeling at the bank, a broken old man. The Rusalka within her snarled. He suffers, but he breathes. He feels the sun on his face. You felt only the river's cold piss. His pain is a fleeting thing. Yours is eternal. He must join you in the dark. But the new voice, the fragile voice of Marilla, whispered back, "He has carried his guilt for a lifetime. He is a prisoner of his own making. Is that not a kind of drowning? Is his endless vigil not a millstone of its own?" This internal debate was a new kind of agony. The simplicity of her hatred was gone, replaced by a torturous moral calculus. What was the exchange rate for a stolen life? 50 years of self-imposed exile? The terror of a village? The potential death of an innocent child's spirit? There was no answer in the Znarkarka's stolen lore, no ancient spell to quantify suffering. Her journey now turned inward, a descent not through the river's geography, but through the catacombs of her own soul. She swam to places that held echoes of her former self.
She hovered over the spot in the deep where the skeleton of a young woman, picked clean by crayfish and thyme, lay half buried in the silt, the physical remains of Marilla. She felt no connection to those bones.
They were just calcium and phosphorus, a relic. The essence of who she had been was not there. It was in the memory of laughter, in the capacity for mercy she had just displayed. She drifted to the sunken merchant galley, its hull a cavern of shadows. Within its wrecked hold, she found the ghost of a different tragedy. A voyanoi, a male water spirit, sat on a crumbling barrel, his form made of swamp gas and despair, his long green beard tangled with fishing nets. He was mindlessly counting a pile of waterlogged gold coins, dropping them and starting over in an endless, pointless loop. He represented a different aspect of the river's curse, not vengeful rage, but stagnant, eternal sorrow. "Why do you count what you cannot spend?" Marilla's thought voice echoed in the hold. The voyanoi did not look up. "It is what I do. It is what I have always done. The river gives, the river takes. I count." His voice was the gurgle of a clogged stream. "And does it bring you peace?" "Peace?" The spirit laughed, a sound like mud bubbling. "There is no peace. There is only the current. We are carried by it. We do not choose the direction." This fatalism, this surrender to the nature of the curse, was what she was expected to embrace. It was the path of least resistance. To be the Rusalka, to lure and drown, to be the monster they feared, was to simply go with the current of her own damnation. But she had already fought the current. She had spared the child. The Znacharka's knowledge, now fully integrated into her being, offered another perspective. It spoke of balance, of pacts, of equivalencies. A life for a life was the oldest law, but it also spoke of transmutation, that a curse could be redirected, that a spirit's purpose could be changed if a greater balance was achieved. It was a dangerous, nebulous magic, more akin to alchemy than to the blunt instrument of vengeance. She returned to the vicinity of the old mill, not approaching Pyotr, but observing him from a distance. He was still there, a permanent fixture on the bank, his head bowed. He was praying now, not to God, but to her, offering his memories as penance. She could feel the weight of his remorse, a tangible force that stained the water around him. It was genuine. It was debilitating. It was, she had to admit, a form of payment. The Rusalka's hunger was not sated by it. It demanded the finality of his death, the visceral satisfaction of his cold, still body joining hers in the silt. But the Marilla, who had remembered the strawberries, who had felt a spark of joy at a child's bubbles, wondered if there was another currency. If his life, lived in such profound and perpetual penance, could be a more meaningful tribute to her memory than his corpse. To let him live was to force him to continue his payment, day after day, until his natural end. To kill him was to grant him a swift conclusion to his sentence. The choice was no longer merely about revenge. It was about the nature of justice, the value of a soul, and the legacy she wished to leave. Did she want to be remembered as the monster who finally claimed her due, or as something else? Something that could, even in its profound suffering, recognize and accept a genuine atonement. The blue cornflower, insignificant in mass, now held the weight of a millstone in her conscience. It was a symbol of a path not yet taken, a future where the song of the Rusalka was not one of drowning, but of something else entirely. The price for exploring that path, however, was the betrayal of the very pain that defined her. It was a gamble with her own soul as the wager, and she did not know if she was brave enough or perhaps foolish enough to make it. The village's turning tide. A new and different fear began to course through the village,
a current of suspicion and desperation that was far more volatile than the passive dread that had preceded it. The blighted field was a static horror, a known quantity. But Anya's return from the alder pool, pale and trembling, speaking of forming ice and a presence that had threatened, then retreated, introduced a terrifying variable: caprice. The Rusalka was not merely a force of nature. She was a thinking, feeling entity whose actions were no longer predictable. Nikolai, Anya's father, was transformed. His initial fear for his daughter curdled into a hard, protective rage. The memory of the broken old man in the hut, Pyotr, and his confession of a sacrifice now fused with the image of his terrified child. The past was not just haunting them, it was actively hunting them. He went to Grigory, not with a plea, but with a demand. "This ends now, Grigory. The old man's ghost is trying to take my daughter. First the field, now my Anya. We tolerated his presence, we brought him food. And for what? So his sin could poison our children?" Grigory, his own face lined with the strain of leadership, tried to counsel patience. "What would you have me do, Nikolai?"
"We cannot fight the river." "We are not fighting the river," Nikolai retorted, his voice low and fierce. A small crowd had gathered, their faces reflecting his anger. "We are cleansing the bank. We are cutting out the rot. It started with him. It must end with him." The word him hung in the air, no longer referring to a pitiful recluse, but to a source of contagion. The collective guilt that had lingered in the village psyche began to twist, seeking a scapegoat. It was easier, far easier, to focus their fear and fury on the one man who embodied the original sin than to confront the abstract, terrifying power of the Rusalka herself. Pyotr was a tangible target. "The Znarharka is gone. The elders who agreed are dust. But he remains," a woman cried out, her voice sharp. "He is the anchor holding her here." "He should have thrown himself in the river years ago," another man shouted, his face flushed. "Instead, he makes us all pay for his cowardice." The mood was turning, shifting from superstitious terror to a mob's grim resolve. The logic was brutal and simple. The Rusalka wanted Pyotr. Therefore, if they gave her Pyotr, perhaps she would be appeased. The same cruel calculus that had doomed Marilla was now being applied to her murderer. The cycle was poised to repeat itself. Grigory saw the dangerous glint in their eyes, the same look he imagined in the eyes of his grandfather's generation. He raised his hands. "People, listen to yourselves. We are not savages. We will not commit murder to appease a spirit." "It is not murder, it is justice," Nikolai shot back. "It is giving her what she wants, what he owes." While the argument raged, the object of their fury remained kneeling by the river, oblivious to the storm gathering in his name. Pyotr was lost in a world of memory and pain. The cold of the ground had seeped into his bones, a familiar companion. He was waiting for the song to return, for the final summons. He had made his peace with the fact that his death was the only remaining currency of value. But the summons that came was not from the water. It was the sound of many feet marching with purpose down the path to the old mill. It was the sound of grim, determined voices, not the gentle, mournful song of the Rusalka. He slowly, painfully raised his head. A group of villagers, led by a furious Nikolai, emerged from the trees. They carried no farming tools, but thick staves and ropes. Their faces were not curious or pitying. They were set in masks of hard necessity. "Pyotr Ivanovich," Grigory said, his voice strained, stepping slightly in front of the others. "The village, there has been an incident. With Anya, the spirit, It is no longer content to haunt you alone." Pyotr's watery eyes moved from face to face, seeing the anger, the fear, the blame directed solely at him. He understood instantly. He had seen this look before, a lifetime ago, directed at a young girl in a linen dress. "She threatened the child?" he whispered, a new, profound horror dawning in his exhausted heart. "She showed her power," Nikolai spat, stepping forward. "The river froze at her feet. Your ghost, old man, your sin. It is reaching for our children now. It is time to finish what you started." Pyotr looked from Nikolai's rage to the cold black water. He saw his Salala, not his salvation, but the end of a terrible, generations-long story. They were going to give him to the river, just as he had been made to give Marila. The symmetry was perfect and utterly damning. He did not resist. He felt a strange, detached calm. Perhaps this was justice. Perhaps this was what he deserved. He had longed for the river's embrace as an end to his pain. Now it was being offered as a punishment. The difference seemed academic. "I understand," Pyotr said, his voice surprisingly steady. He used his staff to push himself to his feet, his joints screaming in protest. "I am ready." His quiet acceptance took some of the fire out of the mob. They had expected pleading, resistance, something to justify their own violent intent. His weary compliance was unnerving. But Nikolai was not deterred. He gestured with his head, and two men stepped forward with the ropes. Beneath the water, Marila felt the shift. The vibrations were no longer those of a solitary penitent, but of a crowd. She felt the sharp, aggressive spikes of their anger, and the dull, accepting surrender of Pyotr's spirit. She understood what was happening as clearly as if she were standing on the bank. The village was about to make another sacrifice. A cold fury, different from any she had felt before, ignited within her. This was her vengeance, her reckoning. It was a sacred, terrible thing, a transaction between her and the man who had wronged her. These people, these descendants of cowards, had no right to intervene. They sought to steal her climax, to turn her personal tragedy into their public sanitation. They wanted to throw her the bone of his life to make their own lives easier. The sheer audacity, the repetition of the same brutal pattern was an insult that dwarfed her anger at the blighted field. The Rusalka and the girl, for the first time, were in perfect, furious agreement. This would not happen. The water around the old mill began to churn, not from the current, but from a rising power from the depths. The temperature plummeted, a wave of cold radiating from the center of the river that made the villagers gasp, their breath pluming in the suddenly frigid air. The surface of the water, a moment before calm, began to boil with a violent, churning foam. And then she rose. The rising. It was not the graceful, alluring emergence of legend. It was a cataclysm. The water did not part for her, it erupted. A column of churning, foaming water surged upwards from the center of the river, carrying with it the debris of the deep, silt, dead leaves, the broken shells of freshwater mussels, and the pale, tangled roots of water lilies. The very air crackled with a palpable, freezing energy, and the gentle sigh of the river was replaced by a roar that seemed to come from the earth's core. And within that maelstrom, she stood. Marila, the Rusalka, no longer a hidden specter or a shimmering illusion beneath the surface, but a fully manifested force of nature.
She stood upon the water as if it were solid ground, the raging torrent calming to a placid, glassy sheet beneath her feet, a stark, impossible circle of stillness in the midst of the chaos she had summoned. Her form was both terrifying and tragically beautiful. Her skin was the white of a fish's belly, of a corpse long submerged, and it gleamed with a wet, phosphorescent sheen in the gloomy light. Her hair was no longer a floating cloud, but a living, seething mass of black vines and river weeds, twisting and writhing around her head as if possessed of their own malevolent life. Her eyes, those changeable gray-green pools, now blazed with a cold internal fire, pinpricks of abyssal light in the death mask of her face. She wore a tattered shroud of what might once have been a wedding dress, the linen now stained the color of river mud and falling from her frame in rotten streamers. She was the embodiment of the Dnieper's deepest, darkest heart. She was the drowned bride, the rejected sacrifice, the vengeance of the wronged given form and terrible power. The effect on the villagers was instantaneous and absolute. The mob's grim resolve shattered like glass. The men with the ropes dropped them as if the fibers had turned to red-hot iron. Nikolai's furious bravado evaporated, his face draining of all color, his jaw slack with a primal, mind-numbing terror. Grigori took a stumbling step backward, his hand fumbling for the cross around his neck, his lips moving in a silent prayer that felt pathetically inadequate. This was not the ghost from their stories. This was a demigoddess of sorrow and rage, and her presence was a physical weight pressing down on their souls, freezing the very breath in their lungs. Her gaze, heavy and ancient, swept over them.
It was not a look a human could hold. It was the regard of the deep, the patience of the current, the cold judgment of the grave. Each villager felt it individually, a spike of ice driven directly into their heart, showing them a fleeting, personalized vision of their own drowning, the shock, the burning lungs, the final, silent scream. Then, her eyes fixed on Pyotr. He alone did not recoil. He stood his ground, his knuckles white on his staff, his body trembling not from fear, but from an overwhelming surge of emotion, terror, yes, but also a profound, heartbreaking recognition and a staggering, soul-deep relief. This was the moment. This was the face of the consequence he had lived with for 50 years. It was more terrible and more magnificent than anything his guilt had ever conjured. "Marila," he breathed, the name a sob and a welcome. The Rusalka's head tilted, a gesture that was both alien and eerily familiar. Her voice, when it came, was not a single sound, but a chorus. It was the groan of the drowned trees, the hiss of the reeds, the sigh of the current, and the clear, bell-like tone of the girl she had been, all woven together into a tapestry of sound that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the mind. "You would give me what is already mine?" The question was not directed at Pyotr, but at the villagers. It slammed into their minds, a wave of psychic force that made several of them cry out and clutch their heads. You, who watched once, would now become the hand that pushes? You think to buy your peace with a currency I alone own? She took a step forward, not on the water, but through the air, gliding towards the bank. The circle of calm moved with her, the river boiling and roaring around its edges. The temperature dropped further. A thin rime of frost spiderwebbed across the grass at their feet, crawling up the legs of the terrified men. His life? Her voice thundered in their skulls. His death, his suffering. These are my concerns. They are not your bargaining chips.
You sought to cleanse yourselves by offering him. You have only reminded me that the soil of this village is still poisonous." Her wrath was now fully focused on them, the living descendants. She saw the same cowardice, the same willingness to sacrifice one of their own for the comfort of the many. The cycle was laid bare before her, and her disgust was a tangible force. "Leave this place," she commanded, her voice dropping to a deadly, penetrating whisper that felt like needles of ice in their brains. "Leave him to me. Crawl back to your homes and remember the face of the river. Remember that your safety is a fragile thing, and that I am the one who allows it. Now, go." The final word was a psychic shove. The villagers did not need to be told twice. They broke, their human cohesion dissolving into a frantic animal scramble. They turned and fled, stumbling over roots and each other, their cries of terror swallowed by the roaring of the river. Nikolai, Grigori, all of them, they ran, not looking back. The image of the water-walking specter burned permanently onto their souls. In moments, the bank was empty save for two figures: the living man, broken by time and guilt, and the dead woman, radiant with terrible power. The roaring of the water ceased. The churning foam subsided. The unnatural cold lingered, and the circle of calm water remained, a stage for their final meeting. The Rusalka stood a few feet from the bank, her blazing eyes fixed on Pyotr. The mob was gone. The village was irrelevant. It was, as it was always meant to be, just the two of them. The world held its breath. The long-awaited reckoning had finally arrived. The reckoning of water and stone. Silence returned to the riverbank, but it was a new kind of silence, charged and fragile, like the air in the moment before a lightning strike. The chaotic roar of the water had vanished, replaced by an unnatural, absolute hush. The circle of placid, glassy water upon which Marilla stood reflected the bruised twilight sky, a perfect, dark mirror framing her terrible glory. The rest of the river flowed on, but here, at the site of the original sin, time itself seemed to have congealed. Pyotr stood his ground, his body a tremor contained by sheer will. The flight of the villagers had stripped away the last pretense of the world he knew. There was no community, no past, no future. There was only this moment and her. He looked upon the monstrous, magnificent apparition, and he saw, beneath the writhing weeds and the corpse pallor, the ghost of the girl whose life he had extinguished. The relief he had felt at her appearance was now tempered by an awe so profound it bordered on worship. This was his judge, his jury, and his potential executioner.
Marilla glided forward, the water solidifying beneath her until she stood at the very edge of the bank, her feet just touching the frost-rimed grass. The freezing aura that surrounded her made the air ache. She did not speak with the thundering chorus she had used on the villagers. Now her voice was a confluence of the river's many whispers, a sound that seemed to emanate from the stones and the trees themselves. "You have been waiting." It was not a question. Pyotr's throat was too tight for speech. He could only manage a slow, jerky nod. His eyes, watering from the cold, never left hers. "You have carried the weight." Her head tilted again, a gesture that was both inquisitive and predatory. "You have built your own prison from the stones of your guilt. You have lived a life of perpetual drowning while breathing air.
Yes, he croaked, the word tearing itself from his raw throat. A life for a life. It is the oldest law. I have been ready to pay. The Rusalka's form seemed to ripple like a reflection disturbed by a thrown stone. A flicker of the simple, mortal girl surfaced in her expression. A glimpse of pain so acute it was beyond rage. A life for a life, her voice echoed, laced with a bitter, ancient irony. You quote the law of the Znarharka, the logic of the mob. Is that the sum of your understanding after 50 years of penance? That your death is a simple transaction? She took a step onto the bank. The grass beneath her feet did not bend. It turned black and brittle, dying instantly. The proximity of her presence was a physical agony, a cold that seared rather than numbed. You took more than a life, Pyotr. You took the sun on my skin. You took the taste of bread and honey. You took the children I would have borne, and the house by the birchwood. You took the weight of my aging body and the comfort of my dying breath. You did not simply kill me. You erased the woman I was to become. Each statement was a hammer blow, each one layering a new dimension of loss upon the old. She was not listing a crime. She was inventorying a stolen universe. Pyotr flinched with each word, his shoulders slumping further under this new, more precise weight. He had thought of her death, her moment of ending. He had rarely allowed himself to truly consider the decades of life he had stolen, the infinite possibilities he had snipped short. "I know," he whispered, tears finally tracing hot paths through the grime on his cheeks. "I have thought of nothing else. The strawberries, the promise of the house. I see it all, every day. It is a millstone around my soul. I am sorry. The words are dust, I know, but they are all I have. I am so sorry, Marilla." He said her name, not the Rusalka or the spirit, Marilla. And for the first time, he was not saying it to the memory in his mind, but to the entity before him. A tremor went through her. The writhing of her hair like weeds slowed. The blazing light in her eyes dimmed, just a fraction, revealing more of the gray-green sorrow beneath. Why? The single word, spoken in the chorus of the river, held the weight of the decades. It was not the why of the event, the logic of the famine and the Znarkaka. It was the deeper, more personal why. That day, in that moment, when your hands were on my shoulders, why did you push? This was the question that had haunted her more than any other. The how and the what were facts. The why was the open wound. Pyotr closed his eyes, transported back to that rain-lashed moment. He did not see the monster before him, but the terrified girl. "I was a boy," he began, his voice gaining a shred of strength from the sheer brutal honesty the question demanded. "And I was afraid. But that is not the whole truth." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with a desperate courage. "In that second, I felt a rage, a black, shameful rage. Not at you, never at you, but at the situation. That I had to be the one. That my happiness was the price for the village's survival. It was unfair. It was a crushing, impossible weight. And for one single, unforgivable heartbeat, I wanted the burden to be gone. I wanted it to be over. And pushing you was the only way to make it stop." He had finally spoken the unspeakable core of his guilt. It was not just cowardice. It was a flash of selfish, petulant wrath against fate. And she had been its victim. The Rusalka went perfectly still. The last of the churning energy around her dissipated.
The unnatural cold lessened, becoming merely the deep chill of the grave instead of the active fury of the storm. She looked at the broken old man before her, who had just confessed to the childish, human weakness that had doomed them both. The monstrous wrath that had defined her for so long found no purchase against this raw, unvarnished truth. He had not been a monster. He had been a scared, weak boy, and in his weakness he had committed a monstrous act. The desire to drag him down, to make him feel the cold and the burning lungs, suddenly felt empty. It would not give her back the strawberries. It would not build the house. It would only add another corpse to the river's collection, another sad story for the reeds to whisper. The Rusalka's purpose, the clean, sharp geometry of vengeance, shattered completely. Marilla, the girl, looked out from the eyes of the spirit, and she saw not a monster to be destroyed, but a fellow victim of the same tragedy. They were both prisoners, she of the water, he of his memory. Her voice, when she spoke again, had changed. The chorus of the river was still there, but the dominant tone was now that single, clear, bell-like voice from a long-lost summer. "Your death will not give me back my life," she said, and the words were filled with an infinite, weary sadness. "It will only be an ending, and there have been enough endings." She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time since she had risen from the water. She saw the decades of pain etched on his face, the lifetime of payment. "Your penance," she whispered, the sound like the wind through the willow branches, "is accepted." With those words, the circle of calm water broke, dissolving back into the flow of the current. The oppressive, supernatural aura vanished. Marilla, the Rusalka, began to fade, her form becoming translucent, the writhing weeds settling, the phosphorescent glow dimming. She was not departing in a cataclysm, but dissolving like mist under the morning sun. Pyotr watched, his heart breaking in a new, final way. She was granting him life, but it was a life that would now be defined by this absolution, a burden both lifted and made eternally, quietly present. Just before she vanished completely, her form once more that of the pale, beautiful maiden from the depths, she looked at him one last time, and a single, spectral tear, indistinguishable from the river water, traced a path down her cheek. Then she was gone. The river flowed on. The bank was empty. Pyotr sank to his knees, not in terror or penance, but in a grief so vast and complex it had no name. The reckoning was over. The price had been paid, not in blood, but in truth, and the long, slow, painful currency of a wasted life. He was free, and he had never been more imprisoned. The unraveling curse. The silence that followed Marilla's dissolution was of a different quality than any that had come before. It was not the tense, waiting silence of her presence, nor the terrified hush of the mob. This was a deep, resonant quiet, the sound of a storm having passed, leaving a world washed clean and fundamentally altered. The very air felt lighter. The oppressive weight of decades of sorrow and vengeance lifted so suddenly, its absence was a palpable thing. The river's murmur was no longer a lament, but simply the sound of water flowing over stone, ancient and indifferent. Pyotr remained on his knees for a long time, his body trembling not from cold or fear, but from the sheer, seismic shock of what had transpired. The words echoed in the hollowed-out chamber of his soul. "Your penance is accepted." They were not words of forgiveness. He knew he could never be forgiven, nor did he deserve to be. They were a statement of fact. The debt, which had compounded for 50 years in the ledger of the damned, had been called, examined, and settled.
The transaction was complete. He was released. But released into what? His life, his entire identity, had been built around the granite foundation of his guilt. It was the reason he rose in the morning, the reason he breathed, the reason he endured the lonely years. With that foundation gone, he felt a terrifying weightlessness, a psychic vertigo. He was an old man, his body worn out, his future a short, narrow path to a natural grave. The purpose that had given even that grim future a kind of structure had just vanished. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. His joints screamed in protest, a familiar pain that now felt strangely distant, belonging to someone else. He looked at the river. It was just a river again. The dark, intelligent malice was gone. The water flowed, gray and silver in the twilight, beautiful in its simple, mindless existence. He felt no pull from it, no dread. It was as if a haunting, sentient cancer had been cut out of the landscape, leaving only healthy, if scarred, tissue behind. He turned and began the slow walk back to his hut. The path seemed different. The shadows between the trees were just shadows, not hiding places for accusing spirits. The sound of the wind was just wind. The world had been returned to its mundane state, and the sheer normalcy of it was disorienting. When he reached his izba, he stopped at the doorstep. The black, glistening mold that had spread like a weeping sore on the wall nearest the river was gone. Not faded, but utterly vanished, as if it had never been. The very logs seemed drier, lighter. He pushed the door open. The air inside no longer smelled of dust and old grief, but of simple, clean wood and the cool night air. The oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the hut like a shroud had dissipated. He sat on his stool, the same stool he had occupied for thousands of nights of self-flagellation, and waited. He waited for the crushing weight to return. He waited for the memory of her face to morph into the terrifying visage of the Rusalka. He waited for the song to begin again. It did not. The night was profoundly, utterly silent. For the first time in 50 years, the only voice in his head was his own. Meanwhile, the change was manifesting throughout the village. The families huddled in their homes, expecting retribution for their attempted sacrifice, heard nothing. The threatening cold did not return. The unnatural quiet of the river persisted, but it was a peaceful quiet, not a predatory one. And in the blighted field, a miracle was occurring. Under the light of the rising moon, the twisted, blackened stalks of barley began to straighten. The sooty chaff fell away like ash, revealing healthy, golden kernels beneath. The tough, purple-veined cabbage leaves unfurled, their unnatural bitterness leaching back into the soil, their color returning to a vibrant, waxy green. It was not a sudden, magical restoration, but a swift, visible healing, as if a poison was being neutralized and the natural order was reasserting itself with accelerated grace. By dawn, the field would stand whole and fertile, a testament to a curse that had been, not broken by a hero, but willingly unraveled by the one who had woven it. The villagers, peering from their windows in the pale morning light, would see this and not understand. They would whisper of appeasement, believing their threat against Pyotr had somehow satisfied the spirit. They would never know the truth, that their violence had been the final, ugly catalyst for a mercy they did not deserve. For Pyotr, the dawn brought no such simple interpretation. He walked out of his hut, his body feeling both frail and strangely new. He looked at the revitalized field in the distance, and he understood. This was her final act, not of vengeance, but of release for them all. She had lifted the blight, not because the village had earned it, but because she had chosen to. She had reclaimed her agency,
not through destruction, but through an act of impossible, heartbreaking grace. He was free. The village was saved. The curse was over. And standing there in the morning sun, Pyotr Ivanovich, the man who had lived only to atone, realized with a crushing clarity that his freedom was the most profound sentence she could have possibly passed. He had to live. He had to walk in the sun, taste his food, feel the wind on his face, knowing that she never would again. His life, this gift she had returned to him, was to be his everlasting reminder of what he had taken. It was not an end to his punishment, but its transmutation into a form more exquisite and enduring than any vengeance the Rusalka could have ever devised. The legacy of the unquiet shore. The village's recovery was a fragile, bewildered thing. The field, once a symbol of their damnation, now stood as a baffling monument to their deliverance. The barley grew tall and golden, the cabbages swelled to impressive sizes, and the harvest that followed was one of the most abundant in living memory. Yet there were no celebrations, no feasts of Thanksgiving. A profound, unsettled quiet lay over the community, a collective holding of breath. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had not only stared back, but had, for reasons they could not fathom, chosen to spare them. Their theory, born of fear and a need for simple causality, was that the sacrifice of Pyotr's dignity, their confrontation at the riverbank, had been the required price. They believed the Rusalka, having witnessed their willingness to act, had been appeased. It was a narrative that allowed them to sleep at night, a story that painted them as active participants in their salvation rather than fortunate beneficiaries of a mercy they had done nothing to earn. Pyotr became, in their revised history, a necessary offering, and his continued solitary existence was seen as a living monument to their difficult but necessary decision. They left him alone, not with the pitying obligation of before, but with a new, cautious reverence. He was the man who had faced the river wraith and, through his sacrifice, turned her wrath to benevolence. They would leave food at the edge of his property, but never approach. They would nod to him from a distance, their expressions unreadable. He had become a sacred relic, a totem, and his isolation was now complete in a way it had never been before. Pyotr, for his part, did nothing to correct their story. He moved through his days like a ghost in his own life. He tended his small garden, he drew water from his well, which now tasted pure and clean. He sat by his cold hearth and watched the seasons change. The frantic, gnawing guilt was gone, replaced by a vast, oceanic sorrow. It was a quiet, constant companion, a deep ache that had settled into his bones, becoming a part of his fundamental composition. He missed the torment. Its sharp, defining edges had given his life shape. This new, soft, endless grief was somehow harder to bear. He often walked to the bank of the old mill, not as a penitent, but as a mourner. He would sit for hours, watching the water flow. He never saw so much as a shimmer of her presence. The river was just the river. He spoke to her sometimes, not prayers or apologies, but simple reports on the world. The birch trees are turning, Marilla. A cold winter is coming. Or, Anya was playing by the alder pool again today. She seems happy. He knew she could not hear him, but the act of speaking felt like a duty, a way of bearing witness to the world she had left behind, a world she had allowed him to keep. His thoughts often turned to the nature of her curse. He had studied the Znacharka's lore in his youth, before the tragedy. He knew the stories of other Rusalki, spirits bound to their places of drowning, forever repeating their siren song, their rage and unquenchable fire. Marilla had been different. She had remembered, she had journeyed, she had learned,
and in the end she had chosen. He came to understand that her power had never truly been about the drowning. That was merely a symptom, a manifestation of her pain. Her true, exceptional ability, the skill that set her apart from every other water wraith in Slavic lore, was her capacity for memory. While other Rusalki were consumed by the moment of their death, she had retained the entirety of her life. She could recall the warmth of the sun, the taste of love, the sound of laughter. And that memory, that connection to her lost humanity, had been the crack through which something other than vengeance could grow. It had allowed her to see the innocence in a child's eyes, to comprehend the complex prison of his guilt, and ultimately to choose a path of release over one of eternal, cyclical torment. She had not broken the curse, she had transcended it. This realization became his new purpose. He began to write. With a piece of charcoal on scraps of birch bark, and later with a proper quill and ink on precious, hoarded paper, he began to record everything. Not the village's sanitized version, but the true, intricate, and devastating story. He wrote of the girl, Marila, her laughter and her dreams. He wrote of the blight, the fear, the Znacharka's poisonous counsel. He wrote of his own weakness, the push, the millstone, the drowning. He wrote of her return, not us a mindless monster, but us a conscious, grieving, powerful entity. He wrote of the blighted field, the terrified child, the angry mob, and the final, shocking reckoning on the bank. He wrote her legacy. He recorded the story of the Rusalka who remembered, and who, through memory, found a strength greater than vengeance. He knew he would not live to see these writings read. They were not for his time. The village was not ready for this truth. It would shatter the fragile peace they had built on a foundation of lies. But he wrote for the future, for a time when the fear had faded, and someone might seek to understand the old stories, to look beyond the simple tales of monsters and into the complex, tragic hearts that beat within them. His life became a quiet, dedicated act of preservation. He was the sole scribe of a new gospel, a testament to a different kind of power. The rage of the Rusalka was a fire that consumed everything, including itself. But the mercy of Marila, that was a seed. It would lie dormant in the cold soil of this story, waiting for the right conditions to grow. He, Pyotr, the man who had destroyed her world, would now become the humble gardener tasked with planting that seed for a future he would never see. It was a penance far more fitting than any death the river could offer. It was a purpose woven from the very threads of his redemption, a silent, lasting tribute to the woman who had, in her final moment, chosen to be more than her curse. The scribe's last winter. The years following the reckoning were a study in slow, quiet attenuation. Pyotr's life, once defined by the violent, seismic shock of his crime and its long, grim aftermath, settled into a rhythm as predictable and inevitable as the river's flow. He became a fixture of the landscape, like the old mill itself, a weathered, silent presence whose story was known only in its barest, most distorted outline. The villagers' children, who had once been warned away from the cursed old man, now saw him as a harmless, if melancholy, part of the scenery, a living landmark whose origins were lost in the fog of old, half-remembered troubles. His body continued its slow surrender to time. The tremble in his hands, once born of nervous terror, became the permanent shake of age. His eyes, which had witnessed both a young woman's love and a water wraith's judgment, grew clouded with cataracts, turning the vibrant world into a blur of soft, indistinct shapes. His walks to the riverbank grew shorter, then ceased altogether when the path became a treacherous gauntlet of roots and uneven ground. His world shrank to the confines of his hut, his small garden, and the well-worn path between them. But within those shrinking confines, his mind remained a clear, deep pool. The work of the scribe became his entire existence. The pile of papers, filled with his precise, spidery script, grew into a substantial folio. He wrote and rewrote, ensuring every detail was perfect, every emotion faithfully rendered. He described the exact shade of Marilla's eyes when she was happy, the specific grain of the wood on the table where they shared their last meal, the precise, sickly sweet smell of the blighted wheat. He was not just recording events, he was building a reliquary for a soul. He wrote of his own internal state with the same unflinching honesty he had shown on the riverbank. He detailed the petty resentments, the flashes of anger at his father, the cowardice that had frozen his limbs until the moment they moved to push. He did not paint himself as a romantic, tragic figure, but as a flawed, frightened boy whose moment of weakness had cosmic consequences. He knew that for the story to have power, his humanity, his pathetic, fallible humanity, had to be preserved in all its ugly detail. The winter of his 85th year was exceptionally harsh. A deep, early snow fell, silencing the world and isolating his hut completely. The cold, which had once been an extension of Marilla's wrath, was now merely the cold, a physical adversary his frail body was ill-equipped to fight. He spent his days huddled by his small stove, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his breath pluming in the frigid air inside the hut. The ink froze in its pot unless he kept it close to the fire. He knew this would be his last season. The knowledge did not frighten him. It felt like the natural, fitting conclusion to the story he was writing. His own end was the final chapter, the necessary postscript to Marilla's. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, he worked with a focused, serene urgency. He was completing the final section, a philosophical coda on the nature of curses and redemption. He wrote, "We speak of curses as external things, spells cast by witches, or punishments from angry gods. But I have come to believe the truest curse is memory without peace, and the only redemption is memory with purpose. Her curse was not the water, it was the relentless, vivid memory of the life she lost. My curse was not her vengeance, it was the relentless, vivid memory of the life I took. She found her purpose not in making me forget, but in allowing me to remember, and in doing so, she transformed my curse into my duty. A curse is a circle, endlessly repeating. A legacy is a line, reaching into the future. She broke the circle and chose the line." One evening, as a pale, lemon-yellow sunset bled through the ice crystals on his window, he laid down his quill. The final page was filled. The story was complete. He carefully stacked the papers, tied them with a piece of sturdy twine, and sealed the knot with a drop of cooling wax from his candle. He placed the bundle in a small, iron-bound chest that had once held his mother's few treasures. The act of closing the chest lid felt like the closing of his own life. A profound exhaustion settled over him, not unpleasant, but deep and final. He banked the fire in the stove, wrapped himself in his blankets, and lay down on his narrow bed. He did not dream of the drowning or the Rusalka's terrifying visage. He dreamed of the alder pool in high summer. He was young again, and Marilla was sitting on the mossy root, not as a spirit, but as a girl of flesh and blood. She was skipping stones across the water, her laughter mingling with the sound of the current. She turned and smiled at him, and, in the dream, there was no accusation in her eyes, only a simple, quiet peace. He did not wake from the dream. His heart, so long burdened, simply slowed its rhythm like a music box winding down, and then stopped. The long winter's cold, which he had held at bay for so long, finally crept into the hut and claimed him. His face, in death, was not contorted in fear or regret, but was relaxed into an expression of weary, hard-won tranquility. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the hut, the path, and the riverbank in a layer of pristine white, covering the scars of the past under a shroud of silent, temporary purity. The scribe was gone. His story was silent, locked in a box, waiting for its time. The river, Marila's river, flowed on, its waters black and swift under the mantle of ice, holding its secrets in the deep. The iron-boxed truth. Pyotr's absence was not immediately noted. The deep snow and the habitual isolation of his hut meant days passed before Grigori's grandson, a pragmatic young man named Fyodor, fought his way through the drifts to check on the old recluse. He found the door unbarred, the interior cold and still, and Pyotr's body peaceful on his bed. There was no sign of struggle, no despair, only the quiet, inevitable surrender of a life that had long since completed its central purpose. The village gave Pyotr a funeral more respectful than he would have ever expected. He was buried in the small churchyard, on the outskirts of the consecrated ground, a tacit acknowledgement of his complicated history. The priest, who knew only the sanitized version of the story, spoke generic words about repentance and God's mercy. The villagers stood in the bitter cold, their heads bowed, paying their respects to the symbol he had become, the necessary sacrifice that had saved them. They believed his story was over. It was Fyodor, tasked with clearing out the hut, who found the chest. It was heavy, its iron bindings cold to the touch. Curiosity overcoming him, he broke the brittle wax seal and lifted the lid. The sight of the thick stack of papers, covered in the old man's meticulous script, filled him with a sense of profound unease. This was not a collection of recipes or accounts. This was a narrative. He took the chest home, a secret guilt gnawing at him. That night, by the light of a single tallow candle, with the wind howling outside just us it had around Pyotr's lonely hut, Fyodor began to read. He did not sleep. The world outside the circle of candlelight fell away as he was pulled into the story. This was not the myth he knew. This was not the simple tale of a vengeful spirit appeased by a village's tough decision. This was a story of a real girl named Marilla, of her laughter, her love, her dreams of a house by the birchwood. He read about the blight, the true manipulative terror of this Nakharka, and the crushing, cowardly pressure that led a young man to commit an act of monstrous betrayal. He felt the cold water, the weight of the millstone, the searing injustice of it all. He read of the Rusalka's return, not as a mindless monster, but as a conscious, grieving entity on a quest for memory and truth. He read of the blighted field as a work of focused wrath, of the terrifying encounter with the child Anya, and the Rusalka's shocking internal war between vengeance and mercy. He read the verbatim account of the final confrontation on the bank, the Rusalka's majestic, terrible appearance, and her denunciation of the mob. And finally, with a heart pounding in a strange mixture of horror and awe, he read the words of the reckoning itself, the raw confession, the inventory of stolen life, and the stunning, quiet conclusion. Your penance is accepted. By the time the candle guttered out, leaving him in the pre-dawn grayness, Fyodor was a changed man. He felt as if he had lived 2 lifetimes in a single night. The foundation of his understanding of his village, his family, his very history had been shattered and rebuilt. The heroic narrative of the villagers' tough love was a lie. They had been spared not by their own actions, but by a grace they had not earned, a mercy born from a depth of suffering they could scarcely comprehend. He looked at the sleeping forms of his own children. He thought of Anya, now a young woman, who still sometimes grew quiet and looked towards the river with a thoughtful, distant expression. He thought of the abundant harvests they had enjoyed, the peace they had taken for granted. It all felt different now, tainted, yet also sanctified by this terrible, beautiful truth. What was he to do with this knowledge? To reveal it would be to tear the village apart.
It would expose their ancestors as superstitious cowards and murderers, and paint their current peace as a gift from a victim they had failed utterly. It would destroy the memory of Pyotr as a willing sacrifice, and reveal him as a self-serving, if ultimately repentant, killer. The comfortable, simple world would become complex, painful, and riven with guilt. But to hide it, to rebury this truth as Pyotr had once buried the crime itself, felt like a second betrayal of Marila. She had chosen to spare them, to grant them peace. Did they not owe her the truth in return? Did her legacy not deserve to be more than a distorted fireside ghost story? Fyodor closed the chest. The weight of it was no longer physical, but moral. He was now the keeper of the secret, the guardian of the true story. Pyotr had passed the torch. The legacy was no longer locked in a box. It was alive in his mind, a living, breathing, and deeply uncomfortable thing. The story was over, but its consequences were just beginning. He had to decide whether this truth was a poison that would destroy his community or a bitter medicine that was necessary for its ultimate healing. The choice was his, and he had no idea which path was right. The keeper's burden. Fyodor carried the weight of the iron-bound chest as if it were filled with lead, not paper. The words he had consumed now lived inside him, a spectral tenant that rearranged the furniture of his mind. He saw his village through a new, double-exposed lens. The cheerful clang of the blacksmith's hammer was now underscored by the memory of a mob's grim determination. The sight of children playing by the safe, shallow edge of the stream was shadowed by the image of a terrified Anya watching ice creep toward her feet. The golden field, their pride and sustenance, was no longer a blessing from God, but a gift from a ghost, a permanent, silent reminder of a debt they did not acknowledge. He became quiet, withdrawn. His wife, Katerina, noticed the change, the distant look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. "Fyodor," she asked one evening, her hands busy mending a shirt, "what troubles you? Is it the old man's passing? You did all you could for him." He looked at her, this good, practical woman he loved, and the truth sat like a stone on his tongue. How could he tell her that the world she knew was built on a lie? That their security was purchased with a coin of unspeakable betrayal, and that their continued peace was an act of charity from the very spirit they feared? He shook his head, forcing a smile. "It is nothing, Katya, just the winter melancholy." But it was not nothing. He was the keeper now. Pyotr's final, monumental task had been passed to him, and the responsibility was a millstone of its own. He took the chest and hid it in the loft of his barn, beneath a loose floorboard, shrouded in musty straw. It was safe, but its presence was a constant, low hum in his consciousness, a secret that separated him from everyone he loved. He found himself drawn to the river, just as Pyotr had been, but with a different intent. He did not go to the old mill, the site of the tragedy, but to the alder pool where Marilla had shown Anya a moment of mercy. He would sit there, listening to the water, and try to feel what she had felt. He tried to reconcile the monster of legend with the being who could spare a child and unravel her own curse out of a sense of, what? Justice? Weariness? Or a love for the world so profound it could transcend even her own monumental suffering? He began to make small, subtle changes. When the older villagers spoke in hushed, self-congratulatory tones about that business with the river spirit, Fyodor would no longer nod along. He would remain silent, or gently steer the conversation elsewhere. When the children, including his own,
were told the simplified, scary story of the Rusalka to keep them from the water's edge, he would later pull them aside. "The story is more complicated than that," he would say, choosing his words with immense care. "The lady in the river was not born a monster. She was once a girl like any other. She loved, and she was very badly hurt. Her anger came from a place of great sadness." He did not tell them the whole truth. He was not ready for that. But he planted a seed of nuance, a crack in the monolithic image of the vengeful spirit. He told them that sometimes the greatest strength is not in punishing those who wrong you, but in choosing to end the cycle of hurt. He wasn't sure they understood, but he saw the way their young minds turned the idea over, considering it. His most significant interaction was with Anya, who was now a young woman of 16, with her mother's gentle eyes and a quiet, observant nature. She found him one day at the altar pool. "You come here often, Fyodor," she said, sitting beside him on the bank. He nodded. "It's a peaceful place." She was silent for a moment, skipping a stone. "I never told anyone everything that happened here," she said softly. "The bubbles, they were beautiful. And the cold, it was so angry. But it went away." She looked at him, her gaze clear and direct. She was both, wasn't she? The stories are true, and they are not true. Fyodor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. Anya had perceived the heart of the matter with an intuition that bypassed logic. He looked at her, this girl who had stood at the precipice of the curse and been shown mercy, and he saw a potential future. She was a living bridge between the world of the village and the truth of Marilla. "Yes, Anya," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She was both. He said no more, but in that shared understanding, a silent pact was formed. He was not alone in his knowledge. The legacy had found another vessel, one who had experienced its power firsthand. He did not show her the chest, not yet. But he knew that when the time was right, the truth would not die with him. It would be passed on, carefully, to those who were ready to hear it, to those who could hold its terrible, beautiful weight. The burden did not feel lighter, but it felt shared. The story was no longer a secret to be hoarded, but a wisdom to be cultivated. Fyodor, the keeper, understood now that his task was not to reveal the truth in a blaze of destructive glory, but to tend it, to let it grow in the dark like a mycelial network, until it was strong enough to one day break the surface and bear fruit. The vengeance of the Rusalka had been a fire. The legacy of Marilla was a slow-growing forest, and he was its first humble gardener. The slow-growing forest. Generations are not the turning of a page, but the slow, patient growth of a forest. The sapling of truth Fyodor and Anya nurtured did not erupt into a towering oak overnight. It spread its roots in silence, through whispered nuances and altered perceptions, changing the soil of the village's soul from within. Fyodor lived a long life, and he never publicly revealed the contents of the iron chest. But he became the village's unofficial historian, its storyteller. On long winter nights, when the wind whistled under the eaves and the snow piled high, families would gather, and Fyodor would be asked to tell the old tales. He told of the domovoi, the house spirit, with a wink and a nod. He spoke of the leshy of the deep woods with a respectful fear. And when the children, their eyes wide in the firelight, asked about the lady of the river, he did not tell them the simplified, terrifying version. He told them a different story. He spoke of a maiden, beautiful and kind, who loved the river and the sun. He spoke of a time of great trouble, a shadow that fell upon the land, and of a terrible, desperate choice made out of fear, not malice. He described her return not as a monster, but as a powerful spirit of memory, her heart a locket containing both the joy of summer and the ice of betrayal. He told of her great sorrow and of her even greater strength, the strength to look upon the source of her pain and, in the end, to choose an end to the sorrow rather than to continue its cycle. And so, Fyodor would conclude, his voice soft as the embers in the hearth, the river flows, and it holds her memory. It is not a place to be feared, but to be respected. For it reminds us that our actions have long echoes, and that even the deepest hurt can be healed by a courageous heart. This story, repeated over years, became the new canon. The children of the village grew up with a profound respect for the Dnieper. They did not see a hungry, vengeful god, but a sacred, sorrowful place. They were still warned away from the deep, treacherous currents, but the warning was couched in reverence, not terror. The old, blunt fear was sanded down, replaced by a more complex, melancholic awe. Anya, true to her quiet nature, became the village's first true herbalist and midwife in generations. She did not call herself a znakharka, shunning the title and its dark connotations. She simply had a way with plants and a calming presence. People said she had a touch of the old magic, but it was a gentle magic, a magic of growth and healing. She often gathered herbs by the alder pool, and it was said that the plants there were always the most potent, the most vibrant. She never spoke of her childhood encounter, but the way she treated the river, Allahi salam, a living, feeling entity, spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. When Fyodor lay on his own deathbed, an old man surrounded by grandchildren, he called for Anya, who was now a grandmother herself. The iron chest was brought to him. "The forest is established," he whispered to her, his voice a dry leaf rustle. "The soil is ready."
The truth will not destroy them now. It will complete them. Anya understood. She took the chest not as a burden, but as a sacred trust. She did not hide it in a barn loft. She kept it in her own home, in a place of honor. She did not reveal its contents to everyone, but she began, carefully, to share it. She shared it with the village's new young priest, a man of learning and compassion who was more interested in the souls of his flock than in rigid dogma. He read Pyotr's account and was silent for a long time. He saw in it not a challenge to his faith, but a powerful parable of grace that transcended any one religion. He began to incorporate his themes into his sermons: the poison of collective sin, the long road of true repentance, and the transformative power of mercy. She shared it with her own brightest grandchildren, those with thoughtful eyes and a love for story. She read them passages, not as a dark family secret, but as a foundational epic, their own Iliad, their own Kalevala. They learned that their home was not just a place on a map, but the stage for a great and tragic drama of love, fear, and ultimate redemption. The legacy of Marila was no longer a ghost story or a hidden confession. It was becoming a culture, a set of unspoken values woven into the daily life of the village. It was in the respect they showed the river. It was in the understanding that everyone carries a hidden sorrow. It was in the belief that a person is not defined by their worst moment, but by what they choose to do with the aftermath. The blighted field was plowed and replanted so many times that no trace of the curse remained. But every spring, when the first shoots of barley broke through the soil, the oldest among them would remember, not with fear, but with a quiet gratitude for the second chance they had been given. The story of the Rusalka was no longer a tale to frighten children. It was the bedrock of their identity, a dark and beautiful stain in the wood of their collective history that gave it character, depth, and strength. The slow-growing forest of truth had finally matured.
its canopy providing not shadow, but a different, more nuanced kind of light. The unbroken circle. A century is a long time in the life of a village, a mere blink in the life of a river. The world of Pyotr and Marila, of Fyodor and Anya, receded into the realm of foundational myth, a time of giants and spirits that felt both distant and intimately close. The village, now connected by dusty roads to a wider world, persisted. Its name, on few official maps, was still known locally as the place by the bend, the place with the story. The iron chest had been passed down through Anya's line, from careful hands to thoughtful ones. It was no longer a secret, but neither was it common knowledge. It was a family relic, a sacred text consulted on occasions of import, a coming of age, a crisis of faith, a deep moral quandary. The pages, now carefully copied onto more durable vellum to preserve Pyotr's original script, were handled with the reverence of Holy Writ. The story was complete, immutable, a perfect, preserved fossil of truth. On the bank of the old mill, where the final reckoning had taken place, a strange and beautiful phenomenon occurred. No one could say when it began, but a single, ancient willow tree, its trunk thick and gnarled, grew in a perfect spiraling curve. Its branches trailing so deeply into the water they seemed to be drinking from the very heart of the river. It was known as the Rusalka's weeping willow. It was not a place of fear, it was a place of pilgrimage. Lovers would come to carve their initials into its soft bark, seeking a blessing from the spirit who understood the depth of commitment and the pain of its breaking. Those burdened by guilt would come to sit in its shade, not to be absolved, but to find the strength for their own long penance, taking solace in Pyotr's example. Mothers would bring their restless children and tell them the story of the Lady of the River, a tale that taught the profound consequences of choice and the quiet power of mercy. The river itself was the greatest beneficiary of this cultural alchemy. It was never fully tamed, of course. It could still flood in the spring, its currents could still be deadly, and fishermen still paid it a healthy respect. But the predatory intelligence, the sense of a watching, vengeful consciousness, was gone. In its place was a majestic, somber peace. The water was said to have a particular clarity near the bend, and on quiet evenings, when the moon was high, some of the oldest inhabitants claimed they could hear not a siren song of lure, but a faint, melodic hum, a lullaby of sorts, a sound of eternal, peaceful sorrow that comforted rather than terrified.
The legacy of Marila had achieved what neither her life nor her death could. It had broken the ancient, vicious cycle of the Rusalka. She had become something new in the pantheon of Slavic folklore. She was not the mindless, drowning horror. She was the remembering spirit. She was the guardian of lost loves and the witness to profound oaths. She was the embodiment of the idea that the past must be acknowledged, its pain fully felt, and its lessons integrated before one can truly move forward. Her story, in its intricate, unflinching entirety, served us a cultural immune system. It inoculated the community against the kind of collective cowardice and scapegoating that had led to her death. When faced with hard times, the elders did not look for a sacrifice. They looked to their own hearts, to their own responsibilities. They remembered the cost of taking the easy, terrible path. The tale of her journey, from vibrant girl to vengeful spirit to transcendent being, became a metaphor for the human soul's own potential. It spoke of the danger of being trapped by one's pain, of the seductive power of rage, and of the ultimate, more difficult victory found in understanding and release. She was a dark mirror in which the village saw its own capacity for both great evil and profound grace. The circle was unbroken, but its nature had changed. It was no longer a closed loop of violence and retribution.
It was now an expanding spiral of memory, understanding, and hard-won wisdom, radiating out from a single, tragic point in time, touching and transforming every life it encountered. The Rusalka's curse was gone. In its place was Marila's lesson, etched not in stone or water, but in the living, breathing heart of a culture. She had not been laid to rest. She had been translated, her essence distilled from a poison into a balm, her song of lament transformed into a hymn of warning and hope. The water and the song. All stories must find their end, not in a cessation, but in a point of rest, a deep, still pool in the river of narrative where the currents of meaning settle and the full depth can be glimpsed. The story of Marila, the Rusalka who remembered, is such a tale. It is not a chronicle of a life, but the map of a transformation, of a soul, a community, and the very folklore that sought to contain them. What then is her legacy? It is not a monument of stone. It is not a shrine of gold. It is the whisper in the reeds that no longer says drown, but remember. It is the understanding in a grandmother's eyes when she comforts a child racked with a guilt too large for their small shoulders. It is the patience of a husband who chooses to understand a wound rather than dismiss it. It is the courage of a village to look into the dark mirror of its past and not look away, to accept the grotesque and the beautiful as part of a single, inseparable truth. Her origin was not in the water, but in the sun-drenched fields of a love that was real. Her history is the history of a promise broken, a trust shattered, a future stolen. Her life as a Rusalka was a half-life, a Kawasa existence defined by an absence, a phantom limb of a soul that ached for what was lost. Her survival was a paradox. She persisted through the very element that had killed her, a creature of the Dnieper's heart, fed by its cold currents and the warmer, more nourishing heat of her own undying wrath. She grew not in stature, but in understanding. Her journey was not across land, but through the labyrinth of her own memory and the darker lore of the world she had been forced into. She learned the language of curses not to wield them more effectively, but to comprehend their grammar, to find the single, fragile clause that might allow for a different ending. Her adventure was the most profound a spirit can undertake, the conquest of her own nature. Her exceptional ability was, as Piotr deduced, her memory. In a class of beings defined by the single cataclysmic moment of their death, she retained the entirety of her lived experience. This was her power and her cross to bear. It was the source of her unique suffering and the wellspring of her ultimate strength. It allowed her to see the man within the murderer, the child within the mob, and the potential for grace within the engine of her vengeance. Her significant moments were not battles won or treasures found. They were choices. The choice to spare the fisherman whose face stirred a ghost of love. The choice to journey from her home. The choice to confront the architect of her doom in the Znacharka's ghost. The choice to show a terrified child a moment of beauty. The choice to stay her hand against the mob. And the final, monumental choice on the bank, to accept a lifetime of penance as a currency more valuable than a moment of death. Her intricate story is a tapestry where every thread is essential. The golden strand of her love for Piotr, the black thread of his betrayal, the sickly green of the blight, the silver of the river, the bloody red of the village's fear, and the final, pure white thread of her mercy, woven in at the very end to change the entire pattern. Her end was not an annihilation, but a dissolution. She did not die. She chose to stop being the Rusalka. Having fulfilled her purpose, not of vengeance, but of revelation, she released her hold on the form grief and rage had built for her. She returned her power to the river, her story to the world, and her peace, however sorrowful, to herself. Her culture and legacy are alive. They live in the new stories told by the Bend, stories that understand monsters are made, not born. They live in a reverence for the river that is based on wisdom, not terror. They live in the unspoken agreement that the past must be carried, not buried, and that the weight of it can, if borne with honesty, become a source of strength rather than a sentence of despair. The Rusalka, in the common tales, is a warning to faithless men and a danger to the innocent. She is a fixture of the night, a reason to stay indoors. But the story of Marila adds a coda to this ancient legend. It whispers that some Rusalki might remember more than their death. They might remember their life. And in that memory, they might find a power that transcends the curse, the power to forgive, to release, and to teach. So, when you walk by a river on a moonlit night and you hear a whisper in the reeds, do not only think of drowning. Think of her. Think of Marila. Think of the weight of water and memory, of love and loss, of betrayal and the long, slow, painful road to a redemption that may not absolve, but can, perhaps, transform. Her story is ended, but its echo is eternal, a note in the great flowing song of the world, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the memory of light can be a guide. The water holds the story now, and the story is complete.